Good morning or afternoon to you all, and thanks to NTAC and SAMHSA for supporting and sponsoring this presentation today, this webinar. So just to start with some housekeeping, this is a 3-hour webinar. It's quite a long time for you guys to just sit and listen to somebody chatting away from a phone. So what we did last time when we did a 3-hour webinar like this was to incorporate a couple of 10-minute breaks in there. So my aim is to break around 10 to 10 here on the Pacific Coast time. So in about 45 minutes or so, and have like a 5-10 minute break. People can stretch, that kind of thing. Then go for another 50 minutes, have another little break, and then sort of finish up around noon our time, just in time for lunch. Let's see, what else do you need to know? As Tiara said, there's the public chat box that both she and I are going to be monitoring. And in an attempt to make this session a little bit more interactive, because what we're going to be talking about today is formulation, and that should be a very collaborative and interactive experience, we are going to have people sort of calling in or speaking up on the line and providing case examples and kind of doing some live formulation here in the webinar. So hopefully that will be successful. We'll see how that goes. If you have any questions, you can't hear me, anything like that, let me know. I'll let Tiara know and we'll figure that one out. And Tiara's just letting me know to mention to you all the survey at the end of this webinar. So if you can stay connected towards the end, there will be the opportunity to complete a survey about your experience. All right, I think that's all the housekeeping. So, oh, final thing to say, I have a cough, so I will attempt not to cough for 3 hours, but it will be a feature of this wonderful morning that you'll all be exposed to, and I apologize for that. So, just thinking about the kind of the overall aim and focus of this session today. So this webinar is really focusing on how we can use formulation and incorporate formulation into our treatment and support of people with psychosis to really inform the interventions that we develop to help people reach their goals. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. And let's see, I can make this move forward. I cannot make this move forward. Oh, I can make this move forward. Excellent. So as you can see there, this is hosted by the ESA Center for Excellence and the NTAC National TA Network and through SAMHSA. So thank you very much to the support for this process. Moving forward again. Why am I not going forward? Apparently I can go forward, but very, very slowly. So the learning objectives for today are to help you all have an understanding of the principles of formulation, why that's important within therapy and the context for that. And, okay, Tiara's actually, there was I thinking I was doing the form going forward, and Tiara's actually doing that. I need to use the arrow screens on the bottom. Oh, there we go. There we go. I was joking at the beginning about Tiara being mission command, and she is indeed. She was making it move forward. I can do it. All right. Okay, got this. Good. So the idea of this is to introduce formulation, the importance of formulation, how this really supports our treatment and intervention, and to think through how we can do formulation in a collaborative style so that both the clinician and the client are really on board with the elements of formulation and what that means and how to use that. We can then use different types of formulation, and part of this process is going to be really helping you to think through the different types that are available, when to use which type, and how to make those choices. Thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of different types of formulation and how I might use those for different types of presenting problems. And then importantly, how do we use this formulation approach to then really identify what effective interventions are? As I said, we're going to be trying to break this into 3 parts. And so initially we'll talk about just an overview of formulation, what it is, why it's important, provide an introduction to what we call the maintenance formulation, and then think through some clinical case examples, both ones that I will present and ones that we'll have presented from the audience. The second part will take that a little bit deeper and a little bit further and think through this idea of a longitudinal formulation and why it might be important to consider early experiences as part of a person's conceptualization, and again think through clinical case examples that both I will present and I'll have the audience talk about. And then part 3 will take it into more of a big picture, what's called the making sense formulation, and this is a formulation that can often be used to support teams and support team interventions, and again thinking through clinical case examples, both my own and ones that we'll get from participants. There are other formulations I want to note, but these are the main 3 that we'll focus on today, sort of hitting on each of the kind of big picture areas for working with psychosis. I'm going to just talk very, very briefly about CBT. I've made the assumption in this webinar that overall people probably have a pretty good understanding of what CBT is, and so I'm not going to go into this in too much depth. Really, this would be considered more of a sort of intermediate level training, building upon the sort of building blocks that people already have around basic CBT skills and sort of foundational CBT. But having said that, just to make sure we're all on the same page, we'll talk about what this is. So this CBT thing is essentially how what you think and what you do impacts how you feel. And thinking can include both how you think about yourself, the world, and other people. And typically in CBT, we have this sort of here and now focus, thinking about the present, but we may be drawing upon past experiences to explain schema formation or core beliefs. And you'll see how we can do that with 2 of the different formulations that we talk about today. And sort of in a nutshell, I mean, this is a very familiar triangle for many of you in ways of thinking about what CBT is, connection of thought, feelings, and feelings and behaviors. But at a very basic level, this is a formulation in and of itself, just making the connection between these 3 important areas, helping a client understand the link between these, and then importantly, using this to identify where changes might need to be made in order to move therapy forward. So at a very basic level, you could consider this to be a formulation. Excuse me again. Just thinking about CBT and what this is sort of more generally, I like to kind of present this slide and to think about this in the context of how actually many people, many clinicians will tell me that they're very comfortable doing CBT for depression and anxiety, but feel less comfortable working with psychosis in this model. And so a while back now, I developed this slide to really demonstrate that if you have competence and confidence in doing CBT for depression and anxiety, you really have the basic building blocks for then applying this approach to working with psychosis. So, you know, CBT for depression and anxiety and CBT for psychosis both have a basis in a cognitive model. They are both formulation-driven, structured therapy approaches. They both start by developing a shared problem list and identifying shared goals that we're working through in therapy. Both take an educational approach, using guided discovery to support the client to really make their own reflections and to gain insight themselves into the process and into what needs to change. Both incorporate homework to support learning and skill generalization outside of the therapy setting. Both are time limited, although what we might consider to be time limited may differ between CBT for depression and anxiety and CBT for psychosis. And both incorporate an element of relapse prevention or wellness planning. So there's a lot of overlap between CBT for depression and anxiety and CBT for psychosis, which is obviously makes sense since they have their roots in the same sort of foundational models. There are obviously differences too, and so some of the things to consider for working with psychosis might be the pace or the speed with which you're applying some of these interventions or developing a formulation. Where psychoeducation might be a strong component of depression and anxiety and psychosis, we also might take a more strong normalization approach for working with psychosis. Both are highly collaborative, obviously, but working with psychosis, we might also be a little bit more exploratory and doing what would be called sitting on the collaborative fence as we explore a person's beliefs or understanding of the world. So there's a lot of overlap, but we also have to recognize that there are some differences that make CBT for psychosis particular for working with individuals who are experiencing psychotic symptoms. So what is this formulation thing that we keep talking about? Well, it's essentially a way of organizing any information that's been gathered through assessment. And so obviously assessment is something that starts early in the process of therapy. In fact, it's something that may start even before therapy starts. If you are working in a setting where you assess for eligibility criteria to enter the service, and then maybe somebody doesn't enter therapy for a little while because of waiting lists or other priorities, all that information gathered in that initial assessment is something that can be taken forward later to inform therapy. But assessment is also an ongoing process, so I really consider this to be an iterative process between information that we're gathering from the person that leads us to then develop a formulation or a way of understanding what's happening with the individual, which then may necessitate further assessment or further information development or gathering. So it's really very iterative, but the formulation informs assessment, and similarly, assessment might inform formulation, if that makes sense. A formulation or a conceptualization, I have to say that I use the two words somewhat synonymously, may propose links between current symptoms and early experiences. So we might want to think back as to what the person experienced as a child, growing up, triggers or precipitating factors prior to the onset of their mental health issues to try and understand any links between these. And then also a formulation would, in that sense, help to explain maybe the onset or the timing of the onset of symptoms. Is this something that we can see as a result of a particularly stressful period for a person? Or any factors that are maintaining symptoms? Again, very important for us to know in order to then inform treatment. And with that in mind, a formulation is also setting an agenda for intervention. So although we will be going into a therapy session and into developing a formulation with goals very much in mind, as we develop the formulation and step back and start to think about, well, what does this tell us and what does this tell us about where we can intervene? It's a way of informing a treatment plan and seeing that X, Y, and Z need to be addressed in a particular order as informed by the formulation. So again, it's very iterative in that sense, and hopefully that will become a little bit more clear as we see some actual examples of this. And then importantly, as much as possible, formulation should always be developed collaboratively. So this isn't a case of the clinician sitting down in their office with a pens and paper and ruler or whatever and drawing out a beautiful formulation that's color coordinated and arrows going here, there, and everywhere, reviewing the charts, thinking about the last session with the client and coming up with something that really is lovely and makes sense, and then you come back and you show it to the client and hope that they agree with you. I share that as an example of my very first client that I worked with when I was a trainee way back in many, many, many moons ago, who was lovely, and bless her, was very, very tolerant of me doing that. But I certainly developed my formulation on my own, came back to her with this and was like, hey, this is what I've come up with, what do you think? And was a little bit disappointed when she wasn't immediately blown away with the brilliance of this beautifully color-coordinated thing. Since my young years, I've learned it's far more effective, obviously, and far more powerful and far more in line with the model if we're actually doing this in a collaborative sense. It allows the client to address any misunderstanding. It allows us to put out theories and hypotheses and either incorporate them into the formulation or throw it out if it doesn't fit. It allows the client to be very much involved and to take ownership of the process. And ultimately, if we think about CBT as being something that supports the client to become their own therapist, then this is a tool and a skill that they can learn and to use in an ongoing manner, in a way that wouldn't happen if we're just forever sort of feeding a person with this formulation and expecting the client to be blown away by the brilliant insights of the therapist. So as much as possible to be developed collaboratively, although as a caveat to that, you'll see later where I will talk about how there may be times when it's useful to step back as a team and think about team formulation that might be done separately. And then can enhance alliance by showing insight and interest into the client's situation. Again, if done collaboratively, that we're really sitting down and taking the time to figure this out together and to try and make sense of what's going on together. So it's not this prescribed experience of maybe psychoeducation where, as a clinician, I'm coming in and providing information about symptoms and about the onset of schizophrenia and what we know about that, or how certain stresses may exacerbate certain symptoms. It's much more of a sort of a two-way exchange of information and understanding. I should have also said at the beginning of this webinar, feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'll try and pause periodically for questions as well, but Tiara will be monitoring that, as will I, but also feel free to throw questions out there. Having just said how collaborative formulation should be, it feels a little bit artificial in many ways for me to just be talking at you all for so long in an unchecked and unreined kind of manner. Truly, I could just start waffling about anything, and I guess who knows what would happen. So let's see. When we are training clinicians in competent CBT generally, and training people to competence in CBT for psychosis, one of the ways in which we establish if a clinician has understood the training and is applying the skills in therapy as intended is to use something called the Cognitive Therapy Scale Revised, or the CTSR, that was developed by Blackburn quite a few years ago now. And so what this sort of training entails is following the didactic training that should be relatively interactive and really practicing of the skills. The clinician is then going away, using these skills with their client, taping those sessions, and then having those sessions reviewed by somebody trained to competence in the approach and trained on this measure. And then that person who's listening to the tape is using this scale, the CTSR, to establish if CBT is being delivered in a competent manner. And then there are different standards for establishing what competence is. Just as a sort of tangent, typically for CBTP, competence is taken as 3 consecutive tapes that score at 50% or above, and then the clinician is considered to be competent in the approach. Now we use the CTSR, which is a general measure of competence for CBT, because the psychosis, let me say that again, the psychosis-specific competence measures have all been developed with specific models in mind, and usually and typically for specific models in mind that have been developed for research protocols. So they become very, very specific, as opposed to the CTSR that can be more broadly applied. There are challenges with the CTSR in that it doesn't get some of those adaptations and nuances of working with psychosis, but it's used the most widely, and so it's the one that I typically, well, it is the one that I use in training and consultation with clinicians. On a side note, we are working, myself and Tanya Lacombe, who's up in Montreal, to revise the CTSR and create the CTSRP, so the Cognitive Therapy Scale Revised for Psychosis, which includes a couple of extra domains that really hopefully gets at some of those things that are so key and central to working with psychosis. So, for example, being able to demonstrate more flexibility in the model than you might need or see in working with depression or anxiety. bringing in more of a strengths focus and bringing in sort of an appreciation and an understanding and a way of integrating cultural considerations. None of those are actually in the CTSR. So we're in the process of hopefully getting that measure published, and then we'll start to use it. But as a total side note and tangent. Back to the CTSR, as we use it here, it's made up of 12 different domains, and the 10th item on the CTSR is formulation. And the reason I include this here is to show what their definition of formulation is and how we then use that to establish if a person is sort of competently developing formulation in their session. So here they say the patient should be helped to gain an appreciation of the history, triggers, and maintaining features of his or her problem in order to bring about change in the present and future. The therapist, and I've underlined this is my underlining, the therapist should help the patient to gain an understanding of how his or her perceptions and interpretations, beliefs, attitudes, and rules relate to his or her problem. A good conceptualization will examine previous cognitions and coping strategies as well as current ones. And this theory-based understanding should be well integrated and used to guide the therapy forward. Again, I bolded that. So this is generally what we're looking for when we're thinking about formulation with psychosis. I think the key things to stand out there is this really helping a client to gain an appreciation. And then, as I've mentioned before, but always worth reiterating, this has to guide the therapy forward. If this is not telling us how to proceed, it's really kind of pointless. So the formulation is kind of doing the work for you. And that's that's what I find the most fun about it. Some considerations when we're thinking about formulation. So obviously in therapy, risk issues should be addressed first. So we're not going to be diving into a formulation at the expense of addressing any risk. So as always, risk would be prioritized. We might want to think about threats to engagement through the development or sharing of the formulation. So we would want to consider any difficulties around sharing the formulation or the impact of the formulation. So for example, if we think about certain delusional beliefs as being very protective for an individual, or for an individual who's experiencing grandiose beliefs and feels quite comfortable with those, but we might consider a formulation whereby those beliefs are actually very protective for the individual who, if they were to step back and gain an appreciation that those beliefs were not founded in reality and the reality was very different to what their belief system currently was, then we might think about the impact of that as being particularly negative for the individual. If their reality and their delusional belief is very, very different. Another example would be when I was working in a forensic setting many years ago, working to develop formulation with a gentleman who had attacked his mom, and he loved his mom. He really was, they were there, they were supporting him. He spoke very fondly and proudly about his mom, and it was his belief that it was actually aliens that had that had attacked her and resulted in a head injury and being hospitalized. And he had absolutely no sort of buy-in or awareness of the fact that he was involved in that, and it was him who had attacked. And so as we were developing formulation, exploring this, understanding it better, he came to the realization that it was him. And there was this moment of sort of excitement for me of like, gosh, the CBT thing works. This was way back when I was a trainee and was still not convinced of that. But then secondarily, the recognition and realization that his affect suddenly just shifted. He became very distressed, and the impact of sharing that formulation was really quite catastrophic for him. Happily, we were on a forensic unit. He was monitored for safety. That's one of the great things about being in a system where there's many people then supporting the client, and we're able to help him through that. And it was very, very important work that he was able to recognize that and work through that. Recognition and understanding and acceptance of the index offense was part of the client's progress through that system, so very important. But he was not somebody I would have felt comfortable with having that sudden realization in an outpatient unit or an outpatient setting and then sending home, for example. I think that would have been quite dangerous for him. So we have to be thinking about what is the potential impact for this and how are we going to hold any aftermath from sharing formulation. A note on language, and I always feel a little bit silly putting this one up, and yet time and time again, I will listen to tapes or I'll talk to people and I'll realize actually this is, and I'll do it myself, I will realize that this is actually a really important thing for us to think about, is the difference between thoughts and feelings and the vernacular that we use around these, particularly in North America. So, we often use language that makes our thoughts and feelings quite interchangeable. And if part of the point of formulation is helping a client to recognize what their thoughts, their emotions, and what behaviors are, and have to sort of disentangle these and see how they interlink, we have to also help people to recognize when they're perhaps using these terms interchangeably so they can separate. So for example, I feel angry, great example of an emotion. I feel like things aren't fair, more like a thought. So things aren't fair, or this isn't fair would be a thought, but we're using, often here in North America, I feel like as a way of expressing a thought that becomes to sound more like a feeling, if that makes sense. This is one of those situations where if we're all in the room together, I'd see you nodding and I'd know that we'd got that, or I'd see you all looking incredibly confused and I'd keep waffling on. I thought it was scary. Again, an example of oh, thank you, some nodding, awesome. I thought it was scary as an example of actually an emotion rather than a thought. And again, we would want to help disentangle that with the client. I feel freaked out. What does it feel like to be freaked out? I thought I was freaking out. What does that feel like? We want to know what that means for the client. I feel like you're being a jerk. Definitely a thought. What does it feel like when I have the thought you're being a jerk? I feel anxious. I feel frustrated. So important to catch our own language around this, and important to help a client differentiate between the two. Okay, so that's sort of like CBT generally. Moving into CBT for psychosis, again, a little bit of a refresher for many of you, I'm sure. When we're talking about CBT for psychosis, our focus is really on reducing the distress caused by positive symptoms, including hallucinations and unusual thoughts or delusions, and helping to support increased functioning. When we think about addressing thoughts, just in a nutshell, we know it's the interpretation of the event that causes distress rather than the event itself, and so we might be helping the client to check the accuracy of that interpretation. With behaviors, we might want to look at how current behaviors are maintaining the problem, and then check the helpfulness of current behaviors or if those behaviors need to be modified or adapted. And as you can imagine, we can do both of those through looking at formulation. So by identifying what thoughts are occurring when a specific event happens, then we may be wanting to evaluate those thoughts, check them, identify if there are different thoughts necessary, but it's important to know what the thoughts are and in what way is that thought distressing. Similarly to the formulation, we want to identify what those behaviors are and really linking and understanding how do those behaviors potentially inadvertently reinforce the situation or maintain the situation, and then from an intervention standpoint, what do we need to do to change the behavior so that it is maybe not maintaining the challenges or difficulties associated with the event. In a sort of general, kind of overgeneralized sense, this is a way of sort of breaking down the different focus points of working with psychosis across sort of a trajectory of chronicity. So working with those individuals who may be at clinical high risk of developing psychosis, who have not yet developed fully psychotic symptoms, but are struggling with what we call attenuated symptoms, so sort of weakened forms of psychotic symptoms. Not yet enough for us to say this is full psychosis, but enough for us to say, that looks like something on its way to psychosis. Working with the CHR population from a CBT approach, we're really directly addressing attenuated symptoms, testing out and developing new explanations for their experiences, addressing any comorbid anxiety or depression, and because of the age range of this population, typically also addressing school and peer functioning. Just of note, for this clinical high-risk population, CBTP, or CBT for clinical high risk, is kind of the #1 recommended intervention for this group, and is something that has, as we look to, or as the United States, SAMHSA and NIH start to think about sort of growing CHR services in the United States, CBT has been one of the sort of named interventions to be included in those services because of the data on CBT for that population, which is very, very good and very exciting. Kind of moving up the next level, if you like, those experiencing early psychosis, so those who have had a very recent onset of fully psychotic symptoms or experiencing their first fully psychotic episode, would be addressing acute fully psychotic symptoms, developing explanatory models and beliefs about psychosis and beliefs around self-stigma or stigma generally around psychosis, and developing maybe an explanatory framework that fits for the individual, addressing and talking about medications through this, and then involving families, which actually clinical high risk should also have that bullet point too, would be involving families a lot in that stage. And then for individuals who are experiencing more of a chronic psychosis presentation, who have maybe held these beliefs for a lot longer, we'd be maybe focusing more on wellness planning, developing and refining coping skills, and addressing functional goals, often trying to think about ways in which we can perhaps circumvent the belief. So if the belief is getting in the way of functioning, how can a person hold that belief and still function in the way that they want to? So it's a very generalized, kind of overly generalized way of thinking about how to address at these different stages, recognizing that we can also do each of those across different stages as well. And then this is a paper that I really liked that came out last year that was written by Alison Brabham and Toni Morrison and Rory Byrne, who was responding to criticisms of CBTP that have been sort of much discussed in the UK. And sort of Ali's argument was really that the criticisms are based on a misunderstanding of the approach of CBTP. So they wrote this paper and sort of concluded with these 10 tips for ethical and competent CBTP. Some of the criticisms of CBTP, by the way, being things like it being overly reductionistic and focusing more on skills and tools rather than sort of understanding of what a person experiences. And hopefully, as you will see today, actually that is really highly emphasized. So their 10 tips for this ethical and competent CBTP are to really include and embrace being collaborative with the client, using everyday language, again, that supports collaboration, acknowledging the historical context. I folded that because that really fits within this understanding of formulation for this piece, evaluating appraisals and beliefs, whereas in CBT traditionally we might have used the language of like challenging thoughts, and I think that's still perhaps fair to do with depression and anxiety, where a client might come in and say, well, I know this is really kind of illogical or irrational and I want to be able to challenge that thought when it comes up. If we're taking that approach when we work with psychosis, we come in from, it may lead us to come in from a perspective of being, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of the expert and kind of a paternalistic, like I'm coming in to challenge your belief because I believe that my belief is more accurate and valid than your belief. And that already sets us up in a maybe kind of combative relationship rather than a collaborative one. And so using language like evaluating or exploring together and being open to the possibility that either one of us might be correct, allows us to really join around this process of understanding the experience of the individual. So as much as possible, trying to stay away from language like challenging. Being cautious with the stress vulnerability model is one that we use a lot to understand psychosis, but feedback from several consumer groups have been that understanding it in this sense can be somewhat sort of minimizing the person's experience and can sort of be kind of overemphasizing that vulnerability piece. So understanding this in the context of certainly some genetic vulnerability, but really a real appreciation of the stresses that people have been exposed to, validating the client's experience through their history and through that process of being in therapy, coming from a place of hope and recovery orientation, and offering informed choice as part of this. Excuse me. I think actually part of this informed choice piece as well is that it's really being supported through some of the data. Has been a recently published study in the Lancet about comparing CBTP and medications alone, so three arms to the trial, and helping people to have choices around the sort of treatment that they receive through studies like that. And then importantly, as we are here today talking about training and about kind of consultation and supervision, ensuring that people delivering this approach have access to adequate training so that they truly understand the model, the ethos, the principles of this, and that they have access to ongoing consultation and supervision to ensure that, again, people are delivering this to the highest level of competence, and that they have a place and a format to really talk about any of the challenges that they might experience as part of providing CBTP. Okay, let's see. So moving now into more of the sort of formulation piece, and I guess I was just pausing for a second. I was like, why did I choose that picture? And I was like, oh, now it makes sense. So if we think about that gold nugget on the top as being our outcomes, I really think about formulation as being the thing that scaffolds the progress and the way towards their outcome or the goal. And without the formulation, my fear is always that it's like throwing spaghetti at the wall. In fact, I gave a family workshop a couple of weeks ago now where what we've tried to do is distill some of the key CBT for psychosis skills into a kind of easily digestible format that family members might be able to use to support themselves and their loved ones. And so we're talking about, when we talk about the maintenance formulation, just using this as a way of stepping back and perhaps trying to make sense of what's happening for their loved one and for themselves as they're feeling stressed. And one of the family members raised a hand and she's like, oh, this is amazing, because in the past, my son would always say that whenever I'm trying to help him, it's just like throwing spaghetti, like I just don't know what I'm doing. And now, I have this tool that will help us identify what he needs in the moment. And that's what I kind of think of formulation. It tells us what to do rather than sitting back and the clinician sort of opening up the toolbox and just throwing out whatever tools come out. A bit like my toddler when he opens his toolbox and he tries every single plastic tool in there and they're all over the floor. Whereas my husband, as a more advanced and competent toolbox user, will reach in, assess the problem, identify what he needs, and pull out the tool he needs. There we go. I'd never thought about formulation in the sense of my toddler's plastic toolbox. Learn something new every day. So because formulation isn't going to happen in a vacuum, all of the skills that you've engaged in before you start to formulate support your formulation. So having a good relationship and engagement with the client, knowing very clearly what the goals you're working on with the client is, will support formulation. Being able to be collaborative and question in a very curious sense, all of these things will aid the formulation process. So just pausing on that for a second, we know that a good therapeutic relationship is key to outcomes. In fact, if we're not able to form a good therapeutic relationship with a client, there's probably no point progressing until we feel like we have that, because there's going to be a lot of situations where we're going to have to really trust each other and ensure understanding of each other, that the client's going to have to be confident that you understand them, and similarly that you're confident that they understand you. So really, until we feel like we have that good therapeutic relationship, diving into formulation and intervention is probably not going to be that helpful. So this is often an initial focus of therapy, and it's an ongoing process in therapy, including reparation of the relationship where necessary. If there are ruptures to the relationship, if I say something stupid that annoys the client, if they become more paranoid and they're less certain of me, all of these things might require us taking a step back and actually really working on that relationship again. So just to pause for a second, I'm curious, what skills do you use to establish a good therapeutic relationship? Just type away in the chat box for a second and just tell me, like, what are the things that help you establish a good relationship with the clients that you work with? And I'll just pause to take a drink of water. All right, so we've got negotiating an agenda. Great, that's a lovely one to get. Negotiating an agenda together. So we know that from the very beginning of the session, we're working on a shared thing, and it's something that allows you to have that engagement from the get-go. Being humble and friendly, certainly never overestimating. I don't know which way around that is, but really making sure that we're being humble, that we're there to support the person, and being friendly is so essential. Showing interest in their interests and doing those activities with them that they enjoy, absolutely. Watching videos on the session, listening to music together. I've had cats come into my session when a client was less sure if she wanted to come and see me, but she wanted to bring her cat to meet me, so that was awesome. Being friendly, smiling, providing a professional disclosure statement. I think providing personal disclosure as necessary and as appropriate can be helpful as well. Staying curious really demonstrates that we're interested in the person's experience, that we're interested in learning. Checking to see if I'm understanding, so really eliciting feedback from the client. Did I get that? Or did I miss something? Help me understand that better. Being flexible about the time, day, and location of meetings. Awesome. I love that you're able to do that. Being reliable. Oh, these are really coming in fast. This is awesome. Sharing in their interests. Casual conversation at the beginning of the session. Absolutely. Giving choices. Being smiling. More kindness. Not talking down to the client. Absolutely. This allows for us to really collaborate and be in the same space as the person. Giving space to talk about strengths and successes. Absolutely. I think taking a solution-focused and a strength-focused approach is really important. And my office has calming colors, soft pillows, and lots of textures. I love your office. I want to be there. That sounds awesome. Okay. Thank you for all of those. I appreciate them. And thank you for sharing all of those. That gives me hope that we're going to get lots of interaction in this. As we're setting this, one of the things that came up there was like having these shared goals. So we want to have a development of a specific goal to guide the direction of therapy, and the formulation is related to specific problems that prevent goal attainment. So it's hard to do a formulation if things are kind of vague. So one of the questions I'll often ask is like, well, where is the problem in that? And I can say this because I am blonde. I call that my dumb blonde question because sometimes it's a really stupid question because it's pretty obvious. But sometimes it's really surprising because where I had an assumption that it was a problem, actually it was something else. So for example, somebody might be talking about hearing voices in school, and I'll be thinking, well, gosh, that just sounds really scary. And actually the problem is that the person's distracted and can't concentrate on what the teacher's saying. So identifying where the problem is then will help us really inform that formulation. And the reformulation will then focus on skills to support goal attainment. So as you'll see through this process, as we use the formulation to inform the intervention, once we have a successful intervention, we can go back and reformulate, plugging in these successes. What's our new thought? What's our new behavior? And then how does that drive us towards the goal or lead us towards the goal? Hopefully you can see that. It's a little messy, but that's partly my handwriting. But that's just an example of sort of like a collaborative way of drawing goals on my whiteboard that's here in the office. I break it down into these 3 areas. What's the problem? That's our problem list. My dumb blonde question, how is that a problem? And then taking that how is that a problem into what are specific goals from this. And I can't, it's too small on my screen, I actually can't read it, so I'm hoping that you can read it a little bit better than I can. Okay. We can then use curious questioning and guided discovery to support the expression of information from the client to truly understand their experience. And there's a little bit of a difference between what is sort of a traditional Socratic questioning approach that is really very much linked to CBT and what might be more of a sort of a guided discovery approach. And Christine Podesky's got a really lovely paper on kind of comparing these 2 approaches. And I think I need Tiara to play that. We can play that video, yes, whenever I'm ready. So give me, for some nice Friday morning TV viewing, this is an example, this video I'm about to show you, of some rather lovely Socratic questioning. But for those of you familiar with the show, you will see that you will remember it doesn't end up so well for this chap. Yeah, go ahead, Tiara. Show me the video if you don't mind. And this is when I really hope I've got the right link in and we're not going to get a video of kittens, as sometimes happens, I have to admit. Fingers crossed. Do we have the right video? Oh, it looks like the right video. I hope it's the right video.
It's not easy for ravens to fly in these storms. Perhaps John tried to send word earlier.
No. This is the way he is, where he's always been. Never asked my opinion. Why would he start now?
I can't believe he's surrendered the Northern Crown without consulting you.
This is his writing, his signature. He pledged to fight for Daenerys Targaryen. He bent the knee.
I've heard gossip. The Dragon Queen. Quite beautiful.
What does that have to do with anything?
John is young and unmarried. Daenerys is young and unmarried.
You think he wants to marry her?
An alliance makes sense. Together they'd be difficult to defeat. He was named King of the North. He can be unnamed.
Even if I wanted to, Arya would never go along. She always loved John far more than she ever loved me, and she'd kill anyone who betrayed her family.
You are family too. Would Arya really murder her own sister?
Do you know what she is now? Do you know what the faceless men are?
Only by reputation. They worship the god of death, I believe. I never trust godly men.
They're killers. And Arya was one of them. What do you think she's after?
She's your sister. You know her far better than I ever could. Sometimes, when I try to understand a person's motives, I play a little game. I assume the worst. What's the worst reason they could possibly have for saying what they say and doing what they do? Then I ask myself, how well does that reason explain what they say and what they do? So tell me, what's the worst thing she could want?
She could want me dead. Because she thinks I wronged my family.
Why did you come to Winterfell?
To kill me. For marrying our enemies and betraying my family.
Why did you unearth the letter Cersei made you write?
To provide proof of my betrayals. To provide justification. after she murders me.
And after she murders you, what does she become?
Lady of Winter.
If we have to...
All right, thank you, Tiara. So I'm guessing nobody expected to be watching Game of Thrones on a CBTP webinar on a Friday. Excuse me. I used to show a video of Columbo doing Socratic questioning, but I have found more and more that people have no idea who he is, sadly. So I was delighted when I was watching Game of Thrones one evening and saw that clip and decided that was my new Socratic questioning video for any future trainings. So you would have seen essentially what we have there is Littlefinger, the gentleman, leading Sansa Stark to a conclusion that he already has in mind through his questioning, which is it's a bona fide therapy technique. It's certainly one that I'm not saying don't use it, but it's one that allows us to have an end destination in mind, and then we're asking the questions to support the client to get there as well. I will use that occasionally, and sometimes I will also use it and have clients say, oh, you're using that questioning thing. Can you just tell me the answer? Because they know I'm doing it. So maybe I'm just not very good at it. By contrast and by comparison, we can take more of a guided discovery approach, which is essentially the idea that neither client nor clinician know the end point, but we're sort of both in this together trying to figure out what information are we going to need, where are we going to take this forward, being open to different possibilities. Now, as we go through the questioning, we're going down a specific road, and that road kind of gets narrower, but it allows for the discovery of things that I, as a clinician, may not have thought of because I don't live that client's life. So for guided discovery, we'd be asking more informational questions, would be certainly listening, summarizing, and synthesizing, and all of that really supports that formulation piece. And as I alluded to earlier, it certainly didn't end very well for Littlefinger. He really was taking this down a path that was going to position him into a much more powerful place, and for those of you that watch Game of Thrones will know that that is not what happened. Okay. So when we're using guided discovery, we want to be genuinely curious. We're asking questions and we're listening. And I'd say that there is nothing off the table to ask as long as the question you ask is relevant to the situation and to the outcome. So for example, I have a client who flies to Tahoe every so often, and I would love to know whether he goes on a private plane living in the area that I live in. Not relevant. If he had a flying phobia, it would be relevant for me to ask him, is it a private plane? Tell me about the pilot. Tell me about the interior. Like, I could really satisfy my curiosity there. But it's not relevant for what we're talking about to ask that question. So what I'm saying is any question is on the table as long as it's relevant to what we're asking about. We're not challenging or endorsing the psychosis during this process. We're just being incredibly curious and making it clear that we're being curious in the process, and that by being curious, we're not saying, I believe this necessarily, but I want to know more about it. We're not making assumptions. We're asking through this, and we're being open to different explanations and experiences. So taking the position that there can be more than one point of view, and there may not be one right answer necessarily. And in doing this, we're really exploring all possibilities. And hopefully in doing this, what we're also doing is demonstrating and modeling to the client how to do this for themselves, how to be curious about their experience, how to not make assumptions and maybe drop an assumption or try to recognize when they jump into a conclusion, being open to different explanations and possibilities, and acknowledging that not everybody around that individual has to have the same worldview as themselves. summarizing, reflecting what you've heard to check that you've understood. That was part of the feedback and engagement process as well. Asking for feedback from the client, checking in that it feels okay to ask these questions. I had a conversation with a client yesterday about his sexual interest in a person 10 years ago, and you can imagine that was quite uncomfortable for him to talk about. So we were like really kind of, I was really checking in about what it was like to share that information. Encouraging clients to ask questions ultimately through this modeling. And like I alluded to earlier, sitting on this collaborative fence with the client, we can both agree to go to our own side of the fence at the end of the process, but as we're exploring, we're both going to sit on this fence and kind of balance on that fence. And it's an ongoing process. Information gathered supports formulation, and formulation will support further questioning. So just actually, look at that time. Wow, I have waffled on for an hour. Who knew that was possible? Well, my husband, to be fair. Let's take a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll come back to this question. So yeah, 5 minutes is good. Have a little walk around and stretch and all of that good stuff. And I'll come back to you all in 5 minutes. And we'll dive in on this question as our first thing. All right, let's go ahead and get started again. So diving back into this, we were just talking about sort of guided discovery and curious questioning. And just to practice being curious for a second, I guess I'm curious to know what questions would you have about the following statements. If a client said to you, "Devil's possessed me and he controls my thoughts and actions," what would you want to know? What's some questions, assuming that all risk assessment's been done? What would you want to know about that experience? No really right or wrong. Well, there might be a couple of wrong answers, I don't know, but on the whole, many, many different right answers. I just want to get you thinking, essentially, and not just listening to my dulcet tones. What questions do you have about this? When did it start to happen? What does he make you do? Yeah. I see lots of people typing. Why might he or she or the devil be doing that? How does he seem to make you do it? In what way? And how does that control happen? How often does he speak with you? So how frequently is this occurring? Has anyone else noticed? Yeah, would I, if he was taking control of you right now, would I know? What would look different? What would be obvious to me, if anything? Is there ever a time when you're not possessed? Yeah, great. So is there a difference between when you are or when you aren't, or is it always, or does it change in its intensity? Is there anything going on at the time that you feel like you're being possessed or more possessed, or he's more in control? What does it look like? Yes, if I was observing this right now, what would it look like externally? What does it look like internally? What does it feel like? I guess I might make the assumption that this is a bad thing, but does this make you feel distressed, or does it actually feel pretty cool and groovy and awesome to be possessed by the devil? What kind of devil we might want to know? Are we talking about the devil from the old scriptures? Are we talking about kind of devil from the Rolling Stones song? I don't know. A couple more questions coming in. How long has this been going on? Yeah. So tons of things that we can be curious of about this. What does the devil look like? Do you see him? Do you hear him? What does he sound like? Is it a he? Is it a she? What's your religious belief system? How does this fit in with who you are? How do you respond to him or her? What do you do? Do you do anything to try and prevent this from happening? What kinds of thoughts does it put into your mind? Is this a battle? What does it mean that the devil's done this? How do you make sense of this? I'm throwing out some as well. There's tons of stuff. I sometimes think I got into this job purely because I'm nosy, and it's a great outlet for me to ask questions of people without having to be the annoying neighbor who's always twitching the curtains and wanting to know what's going on with next door. There's just so much we can ask, and if we have the relationship with the client to ask these questions, then there's so much we can learn in this process as well. All right, so a little bit behind schedule, but that's not all good. I think we're fine on time. This takes us all towards now developing a formulation. So we've got our relationship, we've got our goals, we know what we want to work on, and we're then going to take, and we've asked questions, we've got information, and we're now going to find a way or a structured format to sort of pull that information together and make that useful in the pursuit of the goal that the individual might have. And again, like I say, it's a little bit challenging to just do this one piece of CBTP training in and of itself. So if it feels a bit disjointed, I apologize. So when we think about the maintenance formulation, it's essentially sort of the simplest formulation that we have. It's the simplest way of pulling information together. It can identify a link between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and may include a person's beliefs as sort of something deeper than a thought, but not always, and it doesn't have to. It can be helpful for its kind of quick and dirty formulation approach, sort of on the fly. It's a great way of identifying how current thoughts and actions may be maintaining a problem, and a really good way of examining a specific event in the here and now. So something that's happened in the last week or so, something that's going to be coming up, or something that's happening right now in the session. I noticed when I said X, you looked really sad. What went through your mind? And we can pull that together in a formulation. What did you start to do? You started to beat yourself up? Oh, that's interesting. So we could even do it right in the here and now as a way of sort of demonstrating this. It can be adapted to the need of the client. So depending upon their ability, their how acute their symptoms are, how cognitively oriented they are, how able they are to focus in the session in that moment, we may want to do thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We may just want to focus on linking behaviors and emotions. When you feel sad, you do this. If it gets too complicated at that stage to add thoughts, that's okay. Let's reduce it to the level at which is going to be the most useful for the client. And this one typically does not incorporate past experiences. It's much more, like I say, here and now focused. At the simplest level, this is what it might look like. That triangle I showed you at the beginning, plus the identification of an event that triggers this. So the event, how is that interpreted? How do you feel and how do you act? There is an ongoing and regularly repeated debate on many of the CBT listservs that I'm on. Periodically, like every few months, this debate will raise its head again and everyone will have a say about it and an opinion as to whether we have a thought or an emotion first. And there are two camps, as there are with anything. Some people will say the thought comes first and the emotion comes after. Others would say the emotion comes first and the thought comes after. Others would say it doesn't really matter. I tend to go in thought first and emotion after, but I also will mix it up depending on the client. So a client I was seeing on Wednesday, it was really clear for him the emotion comes first. And so we put the emotion there first. So we can make it fit with what the client's needs are, as long as we're clear about the difference between these boxes. And then, like I say, we may, if we want to, add these underlying beliefs. The difference between a thought and a belief being a thought being very automatic and reactive and responsive to the situation. The belief being something more deep-seated. We'll talk about these a little bit later. Something that's being formed based on our experiences, and something that's a little bit less, certainly less reactive and responsive, something that's more sort of solidly held by the person. But essentially, each and every one of these informs the other, and so you can see it becomes a maintenance formulation because it maintains the situation or the problem with these experiences. Just to go back for a second, the important piece of this is to also recognize that when we ask a client, what do you want to change, they will often say, well, I want to feel less sad, or I want to feel less frightened. And those are great goals, but we know that, well, they're not great goals. We can make them more goal-oriented and more smart in their goal, but it's a great thing to want to have to change. But we can't just change emotions. If we could, if saying cheer up or don't worry actually worked, then none of us would have a job. So what we need to do, and again, this is a way of demonstrating this, is that by changing the interpretation, changing the behavior, in some places changing or working on the belief, we can then affect change at the emotional level. And this, again, is a good way of stepping back with the client and demonstrating how those other ways of changing emotions don't work. We can't just click our fingers and feel better. But by changing the other things, we can lead to emotional change. So let's see what this might look like with a case example. So let's say you meet Sam at the library. So let's say you're working in the community, you go out and you meet him in the library, and he looks really anxious and describes an experience that morning where he could hear talking. He concluded, sorry for the typo, that this was his neighbors talking about him, making threatening comments that led him to believe he was not safe. He became very afraid and anxious, and instead of doing his laundry as he planned, he stayed in his room all morning. So if we're to put that information into the formulation that we've gathered through asking him questions about this experience, it would look something like this. He hears a threatening voice. His interpretation of that threatening voice is that this is the neighbors talking about me. He feels scared and anxious. He stays in his room and he isolates. And underlying that experience is this belief that he's not safe. Again, if I was in a room, I'd be seeing you all nodding and going, oh yeah, that fits, that makes sense. What we can then do, or I would hope you would all be doing that, what we can then do is step back from this formulation and collaboratively with the client ask, well, what can we change here? We've already identified that just changing the emotion is going to be really challenging, even though that's our goal. So what can change here? We can help the client address and explore their thoughts about this situation and potentially change that if we decide that's appropriate. We can help them change the behavior and ideally help them to see that actually by staying in their room and isolating, they're engaging in what we would call a safety behavior, a behavior that is done in order to help the person feel safer in the moment, but in the long term maintains the problem because they never get the opportunity to find out that actually they would be fine if they were left the room. Or we could explore this underlying belief of safety and help them maybe perhaps feel safer in situations or explore whether that's being misapplied. So using a formulation like this, we have 3 potential areas for intervention. And like I said earlier, the great thing about formulation, and maybe I'm just a little bit lazy, but if we do it well, we don't have to do all that much hard work afterwards. We can use the formulation to tell us what needs to change. What do we do next? It becomes a roadmap in that way. And quite honestly, the best interventions I've ever done are the ones where I've sat back and asked the client, great, what do we change? And then they've used the formulation to come up with what needs to change and what the intervention should be. It becomes their roadmap. And that's far more meaningful and far more useful than me coming up with that intervention because they know their lives. They know what's going to work. And there's a funny thing about humans that if we create it ourselves, we have much more buy-in to it working than if the therapist just sort of hands it to them on a platter. That's true of anybody, I think. So what can this look like? This is an example again from my whiteboard. I vacillate between whether I draw on the whiteboard or whether I have the client draw on the whiteboard or on a piece of paper. I should really get them to do it much more because as you can see, my handwriting is pretty horrific. But it really depends on the client and where we're at and just what's going on. But for the most part, having them do it, I think, can be really, really meaningful and helpful. And again, we're trying to teach people to become their own therapists in this way. So this is the client who has a long-standing history of psychosis, who was minimally engaged in therapy to begin with and was only really coming because his parents made him, essentially. And so it took a long time to establish a relationship and to establish a focus for therapy. And it took a long time for him to really share what was going on internally for him. And ultimately he shared that he has this experience where he's on what he calls the Aryan Brotherhood line, that's ABL down there in the behavior, which is essentially an auditory and visual hallucinatory experience for him, where he is engaging with others on the line and talking on that line and having different interactions and conversations. It's a very positive experience for him. And his beliefs are that he will move up through the system and ultimately be rewarded with a country that he will sort of, it's a little unclear, but essentially govern. I should also point out that we've done a lot of risk assessment around this, and his understanding of the Aryan Brotherhood is very different than you would typically understand the Aryan Brotherhood. And although it sounds risky and sounds scary, it isn't. He's probably more at risk by talking about this in the world and having others not understand his understanding of the Aryan Brotherhood, if that makes sense. So we've done a lot of risk assessment around it. It's not something we're concerned about, but there is a lot. We often engage in a lot of psychoeducation with him about how this talking about his beliefs and using that term could be very, very challenging. So we've done a lot of work on that. And so we don't have an event there, but essentially he had talked about how he'd been on the Aryan Brotherhood line a lot over the week, and he'd felt depressed. And so we had depression as the first point, and I had him talk to me about what the thoughts were that linked to this feeling of depression. And so he said, there's not so much to my situation. I'm making a big deal of this. I'm not really popular with the girls. There's a lot of beliefs around being on the Aryan Brotherhood line and how that the girls on the line really like him and how he may potentially have a relationship with him. this is just a hobby, I shouldn't do it as much. They don't really care about me, they being the people on the line, and it's holding me back. And then his behavior is that he goes back and forth on the line and ultimately actually engages more on the line by talking and flirting on the line because he feels positive, it feels good to do that, and then stays home more and isolates more. So he basically withdraws and engages on entirely in this experience. Now, there's a lot of things that still need developing within a formulation like that. This is the first time he and I had done something like this, so I kept it relatively simple. Building on this, we would want to perhaps identify how depressed he feels and which of those 2, 4, 7, or 8 thoughts really links with that feeling of depression. If I had to guess, knowing him, he would probably say the hot thought, to use Podesky language, would be, it's holding me back and they don't really care. And then what he does to counteract that is to engage more in the line, as we talked about, a safety behavior, because it feels good in the short term, but in the long term, it's actually maintaining this problem of being isolated. And when the line is less satisfactory, when it's more boring, he kind of becomes acutely aware of how empty his life is and how he actually would like to have more social relationships. So I guess that secondary piece is not on the board. It's the information that I'm adding that I'm aware of in my head and I'm sort of formulating internally. And as we talked about much earlier, I'm considering the impact of sharing that with him, given that this is something that is so protective for him. So, I see this as very protective, but what we're trying to do is sort of open up small areas where he can start to make small changes that still allow him to engage in something that's positive for him and non-risky, but allows him to also engage in other things moving forward. So from something like this, what he actually identified and what he has started to do was that he needed to start to go out more. And so he's started going to a bar a couple of times a week and having a drink and then coming home, and that is an awful lot more than he has been doing for the last 10 years or so. So it's something that is a change that he's feeling good about, and it's something that we can build upon. Any questions on that one real quick? He's someone I talk about, so those of you on the line that are in my consultation groups have probably heard me talk about him before. But any questions on that? I'm not getting any, so I'm thinking not, which is good. Or maybe one coming up. Again, a thinly veiled opportunity for me to take a drink of water. I had a question and it's vanished and it's coming. Because I'm going to move on from this one into a different formulation. I just want to make sure there's no questions before I move on. And just while the question's coming in, I'll just point out that this is an example of where I didn't go into the beliefs, because it was very early. It's very early. It's not early in therapy. We've been meeting for a while, but it's early in doing formulation with this client, and I wanted to keep it a little bit more surface. Because again, for me, thinking about how does this go into our beliefs, we think about how protective this is for him, and I think that this would be it would have been challenging for him to start to think about the beliefs, so we stayed much more in the present and much more in the behavior as a place to change. And the comment here makes me have a new appreciation of someone joining an extremist group, wanting to be part of something, and needing to feel belonging and importance. And that's Nishan. Thanks, Nishan. Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting because he would love to meet the Aryan Brotherhood and join it. And to be honest, it's something that we've explored to show how challenging that would be for him. And I think it would be really problematic because he wouldn't be able to be connected. But I think what it really emphasizes is the need for human connectedness, and how a lot of what we see around psychosis is often, if we again think from a kind of big picture formulation, which we will do later, thinking about social defeat. And this person has experienced a lot of social defeat. Another example of formulation that just goes for thought, feeling, and behavior, but actually has a whole lot going on this picture. This is a a woman in her 40s who has the diagnosis of schizophrenia and has a lot of ideas of reference that she can recognize as such, but still gets very, very triggered and very upset by, and in the moment is quite disabled by, although looking back she can come away and she goes, it's so stupid, I can't believe I thought that, oh my gosh, and will really beat herself up. And so we really conceptualize that more as worry. So down the bottom you can see, well, we've got the event at the top. So her event had been, and it just happened, so she came in kind of annoyed by this and upset by it, that she'd gone to the cafe that she usually goes to and got charged a different amount for her tea, which for many people we'd either be like, awesome, free tea, or cheaper tea, or just kind of shrug it off, or to be fair, because I go to the same cafe, it started making me realize actually it happens, and I don't track how much the tea costs, so it happened more than I'd realized, so maybe not even noticing, but for her, she had noticed. And then skipping down to the bottom, her thought around that was, is this a test, or this is a test? She feels weird and uncomfortable, and then she worries and really analyzes the situation. And so what we added here, and I think I've included this to demonstrate how we can be very flexible about these formulations and incorporate information as needed, was her reflections of how her experiences in the current, so if she's in a certain setting where she's had challenges before, or depending on how much caffeine she's had that day, may lead her to experience the world differently. And we also talked about how her brain experiences the world, and how her brain is a brain that really picks up on things that others might not notice. And we talked about hypersalience as that it likes to look for meaning, and it really likes to be busy. So if it's not busy in a moment, it will find a reason to be busy. So we talked about these as sort of filters, that this experience of being charged a different amount of tea gets filtered through, leading to this, is this a test, feeling weird and uncomfortable, and then worrying or analyzing. And so she then came up with some solutions for each of those levels. So finding ways to keep her mind busy by doing puzzles and reading. This is an example then of how we can actually do interventions at lots of different levels. She started to do more mindfulness as something that she could do in the moment, in line, waiting for her tea, where she gets a little bit anxious, to keep her brain busy rather than letting it sort of run free and look for trouble, if you like. She herself initiated decreasing caffeine, choosing a time to go to the tea shop ahead of time, planning ahead, and not looking at the receipt, because numbers in the past have been really triggering for her. So just throwing it away instantly and not needing to engage in that. And then down the bottom was the follow-up items, or action items, are essentially her homework for the week. And then we talked about reformulation. And so as we explored this, she came up with this alternative thought of, this is just random, it's not me. She would feel better if she had that thought, and she could look for other evidence. So instead of looking for and focusing on this idea of this is a test and looking for evidence to support that, and the idea of this being a test was, would I fess up that I'd been charged differently, and if I didn't, would they think badly of me? And actually we figured out that probably wasn't what was happening. And so she would look for evidence to sort of counter that, again, as a way of keeping her brain busy. So an example of how a formulation can be thought, feeling, and behavior, can stay in the here and now, but incorporate these filters. And that was, I don't think I'd ever done one like that before. It was just one that fitted for her to have these filters in there, and then really informed our intervention. Any questions on that before I move on to an example from the group? And Ryan, if you're ready to share a formulation with us.
Whenever you're ready.
Awesome. All right. So there wasn't any questions on that one, which I love to interpret as just stunned silence at the brilliance of formulation. That's my interpretation, and I'm sticking with it. So what we wanted to do, thank you, Ryan. So Ryan Melton's going to share a case example with the group so we can kind of put this together in action. And the reason for that is I always get this feeling that, and I might be totally off base, but I always get this feeling that if all you're seeing are the ones that I've typed out on a beautiful PowerPoint slide, or the ones that I've drawn on a whiteboard, that you could all be sat there going, well, yeah, obviously it works when the trainer's just sat there at home with a glass of wine writing her slides, or maybe she just made that up and drew it on the slide on the whiteboard. So I like to demonstrate it in action to show that this is something that we can do relatively quickly with the information that we have. And sometimes in this process, what it actually highlights, and similarly when we're in the session with the client, is actually the need for more information. So this is kind of an exercise in just demonstrating that this formulation thing is something that can be done outside of a trainer creating the perfect client. So Ryan, give us a quick summary of this client that we have, and maybe kind of introduce us to the specific event that we might want to focus on while I figure out how to do the drawing. There we go.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I've got a couple in mind, so trying to make a quick decision. I will start with a 17-year-old high school student, normally doing very well. He's actually a very high achieving student, grade A student. Began to see a significant drop in his grades, primarily due to the fact he wasn't turning in assignments. In working with him, he described kind of feeling quite scared, distracted in class, because he believed, or was starting to believe, he actually still gained some insight that this sounded odd, that the teacher would read his mind. And then she would do things like write certain symbols on the board, or look in his direction, or do something, these ideas of reference, that she was indeed reading his mind. When he tried to do some of his own kind of cognitive exercises to kind of think his way through it, but it became so distracting that he wasn't paying attention in class and was beginning to, and was just essentially failing the course.
Great. Not great, but great example. Thank you. So I often fall into that trap. So in terms of the event, it sounds like what he notices in class is his teacher looking at him in a certain way?
Yes, that's what he would perceive anyway. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So he notices the teacher looking over to him.
Yeah.
Oops, hang on. So teacher looks at me, and then that should all, no it did not, let me try that again. Sorry, I'm grappling with technology here. That should have appeared on your screens by magic, I believe. So we've got this event that the teacher looks at me, and then how did you say he interpreted that?
I don't know if I did.
He made sense of that.
Yeah, he, because he was just that she was potentially knew what he was thinking, and sometimes he would have, like a lot of students, some negative thoughts about the teacher, and so he interpreted that she knew what his thoughts were.
Okay, awesome. So she knows what I'm thinking. Sorry, I'm messing with technology over here. And how did that make him feel when he had that thought, she knows what I'm thinking?
Well, yeah, he would just anxious, probably how he described it, worried, distracted. I guess distracted more behavior, but yeah, those anxious and worried.
Great. Oops. And again, I keep doing the same thing. Pigeons would learn faster. And then what does he end up doing? What's the action that he engages in?
A couple things. One, he tries some self-distraction. He tell himself that, no, she can't do that. That's crazy. I'm not crazy. She can't do that. Yeah. But ultimately, he started to move to the back corner of the classroom. So he thought that maybe if she was farther away, it would be harder for her to do this, to read her his mind.
Great. So he moves away, and then so self-distracts, but in self-distracting, he's actually focusing on the thought, right?
Right, exactly, yep.
Oops. Oh dear, what's going on now? Oh God, it's all focusing on, I'm going to do that, focusing on thought. Okay, so that's our behavior. And then if we had to make a guess, so you might know, what might be an underlying belief if we were going to go there with him? What might be driving this thoughts and this interpretation and this behavior?
Yeah, it was a tricky one in some ways. He kind of vacillated between I'm going crazy to the teacher has this ability, to do this. And,
And what would it mean if the teacher did have that ability to do this?
it means that he would have to really monitor all of his thoughts,
Why?
because then ultimately she'd be reading them, and he could be in trouble for that.
And so if he was in trouble and the teacher could read those thoughts, what would that say about him? What would that mean? Like either he's going crazy, or if it's true, what does this mean about who he is in the world?
Yeah, he would in some ways meant that he wasn't sure if others could do this, but that he would, that he was going to fail, that he couldn't control this process.
Oh, cool. No, but okay, so like then it becomes this sort of maybe underlying belief of like, I'm not in control.
Yeah, I can't, yes. Mm-hmm.
So either I'm going crazy or I'm not in control.
Right, yep. He would vacillate back and forth.
Yeah, which is and I'm guessing he was CHR?
He fell in that category, yes.
Yeah. So this kind of like, so the reason I point that out and guessed at that was because I'm going crazy is often a very core belief of individuals, or it's a belief of individuals with who are clinical high risk and who are experiencing this, and then jumping between these two possibilities, right?
Right, yep.
Awesome. Okay. So what we've got is, and what I'd be doing is collaboratively, like you were there, the client essentially, is sort of summarizing or having the client summarize that the teacher, when the teacher looks at you, you believe or you think, that she knows what I'm thinking, you become very anxious and worried, so then you focus on the thought as a way of trying to evaluate it and have ultimately moved seats to try and remove yourself from that situation. And then underlying this are the two possible beliefs is either I'm going crazy or I'm not in control. So where could we support intervention for this chap? What might be, and I can put that out to you, Ryan, or to the group, or you could maybe talk us through where the intervention went with him based on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be curious to what other people think. I mean, I certainly have what I tried and what worked and what didn't. But
yeah. What does the group think? Where does intervention? Where does this formulation tell us we might want to intervene? Where's there some potential problems, or how is this problem being maintained right now? I see Ron typing. Yeah, so Ron's saying that one possible opportunity here would be to do maybe a bit of a behavioral experiment and to test if she knows what he's thinking, maybe thinking something really wild that she'd respond to. Yeah, and kind of setting up very carefully ahead of time what would we need to see from her in terms of her behavior to be certain that she'd got this, and would we want to do this over several iterations so we have lots of data points. If we're diving into an experiment like that, we'd probably want to know how convinced he is of this. She knows what I'm thinking interpretation, and let's say, and tracking that before and after several attempts at that experiment. That'd be a really fun, nice one. And it'd be really fun to think of all the different wild things that he could think and see what that would do. So we could get a bit of humor into that, and a bit of, you could get a bit kind of, kind of conspiratorial in some way. We might be asking questions, so Nishan's saying, what you're in control of, when you remember feeling out of control, is that a familiar belief or fairly new? So trying to understand it in a larger context. And then for Andrea, I like this, like, do your behavior stop her from looking at you or actually increase her looking? So, is he, we want to know a little bit more about this behavior. Is he inadvertently, what's the word I'm looking for? Creating her, is he inadvertently influencing her to look at him more because of how he's interacting with her? So if I was in a classroom and I saw a student constantly looking at me and then looking away and looking away, I'd probably be prone to look at them more, which then might reinforce this. So we want to know exactly what that would look like, and then we could do experiments around that behavior as well. Shoshana's asking, would an experiment mean working or changing the interpretation? It certainly could do, or it could mean working or changing the behavior. So it could be, could we identify whether this experience changes based on where he sits in the classroom, if he has that flexibility. I'd be curious about, another question I'll come back to. I'd be curious about this idea of focusing on the thought and whether experimenting with focusing out and rather than getting engaged in essentially worrying. So this is where and I'm curious about you guys on the line, but this is where I often get myself tied up and a lot of the consultees tied up. I think about worry as both an emotion and a behavior, and actually we can have worried thoughts as well. So it actually is one of those ones that hits in all of those. We can feel worried, but we can behaviorally engage in worry as well. So if he's sat in the classroom worrying, and worrying means focusing on the thought, she knows what I'm thinking, then we can see how that's actually going to increase the emotion. And what we might want to do is actually check in on that process and choose not to engage in worry in that moment and instead focus outward on a different experience as another potential intervention. So we've got all these interventions informed by the formulation, and Izzy came up with one as well, maybe coming up with what's the different reasons as to why she might be looking at him, and could be going for any number of different ones, and then trying to find out which is the best fit there. And I'll come back to your question in a second, Carrie. Just before I do, Ryan, any other thoughts on that, or do you want to share what you did that worked or didn't work?
Yeah, certainly it's validating because some of the ideas that were popping up are things that I certainly tried. I actually did try the crazy thought idea. He wasn't quite ready for that because he was still on that. I definitely did like a percentage scale of how much he believed it. So I was really focusing on the interpretation area. I thought that was where I could say, what percentage do you believe on a 0 to 100 scale that she's doing this? And I think it was around an 80, somewhere in there. And I said, well, what would happen if you kind of thought something really wild about her? And, and he's like, oh, whoa, I mean, I don't want to get suspended, kind of thing. So he wasn't quite ready to take that risk. We certainly did kind of that challenge. Are there other reasons? You notice her looking at other students, kind of and trying to challenge, at least the interpretation in that way, or why else might she be looking at him? And he would joke sometimes. He's like, oh, well, I am a good-looking kid, so things like that. So awesome. We would, so we'd make out the list of other ways that are the reasons why she may be looking at him. I certainly probably took another kind of more behavioral approach too, because he also, as he became more and more distracted, he started to add the worry of like, what am I missing in class? My parents pointed at me, so it was just kind of snowballing, quite a bit his thinking. And so we kind of gave him permission in some ways to continue because he did feel better in the back of the class, kind of gave him permission to do that, and then kind of an accommodation of, being able to have his teacher email his mom what the assignments were, kind of thing, without disclosing what he was experiencing, just saying he was having a little anxiety in class and it would be helpful to email. And that actually made him feel a little bit better that he could then go back in the class because he knew he wasn't going to miss something because the email would be coming later to his mom. So a couple of areas that we focus on there.
Great, and I love how that's an example of how we can actually work at both the thought level and the behavioral level, and the two can then really support each other. For me, that's one of the bonuses of CBT is being able to do both as fits. Sometimes you might work purely cognitively, sometimes you might work purely behaviorally, but oftentimes it's a combination of the two and they really support each other. And yeah, it sounds like for him, there's a lot of worry involved, which, would tell us that helping him learn techniques to minimize worry or to delay worry or to not engage in worry might also help. So that's awesome. And then Kerry's got a question about how elaborating on why I'm not in control is not a thought resulting from another belief. I'm not quite sure about what you mean about sort of another thought resulting from another belief, but kind of where I'm going with this is because he's clinical high risk, he has this underlying belief of I'm going crazy, but I'm also curious, I was also kind of curious of like, if it's true, which he's kind of afraid it might be, what would that then mean about him? And this sense about like not being in control tells us that what he's engaging in fits with that belief, which is trying to kind of insert a lot of cognitive control in a situation where we don't have a lot of control, right? We don't actually have control over what we think. We have control over what we think about what we think. So we don't have control over the thoughts that come to us. We don't have control over, she knows what I'm thinking, popping into his head. But he does have control over what he does with that once it comes into his head. Mm-hmm. So with CHR, there's often these kind of like contrasting beliefs that we're trying to establish. But particularly for him, I'm going crazy, I think would be a really interesting one to explore. And control and craziness often are linked in that way. As I was asking the questions of Ryan, I wouldn't have been surprised if kind of I'm not safe or I'm vulnerable might have come up. So I've kind of opened to those as possibilities, but this one around control seems really important, particularly if it's something that's driving this, that he's then trying to address through trying to over-control something that he's not going to be successful at, and continued attempts that are unsuccessful will further reinforce his belief I'm not in control, when in fact he's trying to control something that nobody can be in control of. And my computer just turned itself off. Well, that's really unhelpful, isn't it? There we go, it's back. All right, thank you very much, Ryan. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It's helpful to revisit that case. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you. All right, I just see one more question coming in before we move on to our next formulation, which I think I don't even know how to get off draw. Let's see. Question. Oh, there we go. That worked. Oh, it's gone. Oh, how amazing. I'm guessing it doesn't come back if I go back there. No. Oh, no, it's back. Oh, how wonderful. Sorry if you didn't know how this technology thing worked. I was just waiting for this question to come in before we move on. Let's see. And just because we're doing okay on time, but just because we're a little bit low, I'm not going to open that one up to others. But if we have time, we might be able to do either the longitudinal or making sense with other folk than the ones that we have lined up. Okay, I'm going to assume that something got stuck. Oh, here we are. Ooh, so the question is, what would your thoughts be on a physical barrier? And would you mean something like the client wearing something that, like, if he could identify the blue stops her from accessing his thoughts, then maybe wear blue? Ooh, interesting question. Very interesting question. Very good question. And well, in some ways, he's doing that by moving to the back of the class. And what we could say is it's a safety behavior. So it's a behavior that helps him to feel safer in the short term, and the long term doesn't allow him to realize that actually he would have been fine sat where he was. Again, the other debate, so there's 3 debates that I see raging constantly throughout my entire training in there. One was that thought versus emotion first question. The other is what the difference between a coping skill and a safety behavior is. And my pithy response to that is that we train coping skills, and safety behaviors are the things that clients come to us with, which is a bit unfair, because you could certainly see deep breathing, which we train our clients to do as a coping skill, to be a safety behavior as well. You know, if you're on a plane and you're really anxious and you engage in some nice deep breathing and then you feel better, well, it's helped reduce your anxiety, but also the plane wouldn't have crashed whether you did that deep breathing or not. So I'm being a little bit facetious in being so extreme. But I would say if a physical barrier, as Lisa's suggesting, would help him to stay in school and function in the short term, it might be something we would want to start with. If moving seats is something that would help him to start with, that's awesome. We might then want to help experiment with dropping that behavior and trying something else. But I would say it's about finding the strategy and skill that's going to help the person function without it being disruptive. And so often what we'll see is people sort of ramping up those behaviors as they will use it, and then the efficacy of it might decrease, and so they'll do something a bit more extreme and a bit more extreme, and then, like you said, maybe wearing a helmet would be too obvious and would stand out, but you certainly could see how a person would get to that as their intervention. Again, back to my toddler, who I swear to God I use in almost every training I do now. His behaviors for going to bed are ramping up, and he adds and he adds and he adds, and I'm having to try and decrease all the number of things that we have to do at night before he goes to bed, because each night we add something else. And I'm aware of that as a sort of safety behavior. Yes, you can go to bed without going through the 1,400 different things that you've decided we need to do before we all get some sleep. But so it's essentially, if the safety behavior of the coping scale is impacting functioning, then we might want to change it. If it's something that helps the person to engage in the world in a way that they weren't previously and allows them to function, then let's do it. Yeah, I think that should help. Oh, and then I've suggested a phone earpiece to clients years ago because they can talk to themselves, which is self-soothing, but also doesn't cause them to stand out. Absolutely. Ron Coleman, who is an individual who really talks about hearing voices and part of the Hearing Voices Network and does tons of training on this. I've heard him say how the advent of mobile cell phone technology and sort of Bluetooth technology really helped with his voice hearing, because what it allowed was for him to walk around with the earpiece in and for him to tell the voices, hey, I'm too busy to talk to you right now, come back later. Before cell phones, he would just do that out loud and people would look at him as if he was crazy using his words. But now he can do it and everyone's like, oh, he's just on the phone, it's fine. So it's what works that helps functioning, but if it's getting in the way of functioning, then it might be something that we want to change. Or if it's something that gets added to, it might be something that we want to change. All right. Yes, you should have written a book years ago. Absolutely, Lisa, I agree. I want to write a book on behavioral experiments and safety behaviors. I think the time is ripe for that. I think it'd be a really fun book to write too. Okay, so let's just take a 4-minute break. So it's 10:51 now, my time. Let's come back at 10:55, and then we'll dive into these last two formulations in the last period of time that we have, whatever that is, an hour and 5 minutes. We're good. We've got plenty of time. All right, so let's get started as we go into the last hour of this webinar. So we're going to talk about the second of the three formulations now, which is this longitudinal formulation, but one that I also often refer to as Morrison formulation because it was developed by Anthony Morrison. So the essential premise of this is that it builds on the maintenance formulation and it allows us to really explore the links between past experiences that the individual may have been exposed to and their current situation. And it can include, well, it does include core beliefs and may include conditional assumptions. This is really a helpful formulation for helping to increase understanding and awareness of how past experiences influence life events, including the role of negative life events, identification of what can change and what is stable in a person's life, and inclusion of traumatic childhood experiences into understanding current presentation and ways of viewing the world. So really sort of grounding the understanding of the experience of the person in the here and now through exploration of their past experiences and how that may have altered how they view the world. Considerations to think about when developing a longitudinal formulation. It can be overwhelming. It pulls together a lot more information. And so we may want to be developing it slowly because of that and doing it over time rather than just diving in and doing one in a session and then never coming back to it. So it's something that I would suggest would happen at the point at which you feel like exploring past experiences is going to be beneficial for the client and that they're able to tolerate this. Before I go into that, just to touch briefly on sort of core beliefs and conditional assumptions and what these things actually are. And I guess I actually, again, use core beliefs and schema somewhat synonymously, although I would expect probably experts in the schema world would disagree with me on that. But essentially, different levels of cognitions influence our emotions and actions, and these can be accessed through our questioning. So there's different levels of cognitions. We have negative automatic thoughts or automatic thoughts at the first level, and these are quick evaluations of the situation. They come into our head without really much thinking. They just appear and pop up, and we can often have reactions to them. We don't have a whole lot of control over them. Conditional assumptions are these if-then phrases and are essentially sort of rules and assumptions about the world. And then these core beliefs or schema are these deeply held rigid beliefs about the world, the self, and others that have been very much formed by experience. So negative automatic thoughts as an example. These are quick thoughts that are specific to a situation, the closest to our consciousness, the most easily accessible, the things that when you say, hey, what were you thinking just then? I noticed you looked sad. What happened? What did you think? The person can reflect on pretty quickly. We're generally not aware of them unless we're engaged in an act of reflecting on them or unless they come with really strong emotion. And the presence of a strong emotion is a good clue that these are happening. So, for example, let's say a person who we will remain nameless was writing a CBT training. The negative automatic thought might be, this is going to be terrible. Highly made up situation. Conditional assumptions, this more intermediate level of beliefs, stem from core beliefs and may inform the negative automatic thoughts. Harder to access the negative automatic thoughts, but are rules, assumptions, and conditions that may govern behavior. So back to this totally made up scenario. Situation, writing a CBT training, the negative automatic thought again, this is going to be terrible, an assumption, if the training goes badly, then I am a failure. It's the if-then condition. And then finally, a core belief, a fundamental beliefs about the world, self, and others. These are typically fairly rigid and have been developed through childhood or through a more recent extreme experience, activated by negative experiences and situations. So they're always there. They're always kind of holding them and walking around with them, but are usually triggered by or activated by negative experiences or distressing events in the world. When activated, they then influence how we relate to the world, and they're harder to access unless activated. So if I'm just sat having a cup of tea with someone in a chat and everything's fairly neutral and mundane and everyone's in a fairly generally good mood, it's going to be hard for me to say, so what's that core belief? But in a session when somebody's acutely distressed and crying, and you say, well, what does that mean about you? it will come out pretty quickly. It's very raw, it's very open, it's immediately there. So back to our made-up situation, writing CBT training, the net, this is going to be terrible. If the training goes badly, then I'm a failure. The core belief distilled to its most purest form, I'm a failure. How do we get to this? One way is using this downward arrow technique through questioning, so a technique to identify underlying assumptions and core beliefs that maybe drive negative automatic thoughts. We might explore what the negative automatic thoughts mean to the individual. We can ask the client, so what does it mean? So just like I was kind of doing with Ryan, so if that was true, what would that mean? What does it say about you? And it's kind of an annoying technique, and it's hard to demonstrate it well, although it can work well in session. When I've looked at YouTube videos, they've always been annoying, even though they've been therapists I know and respect really well. But it's kind of like, and what would that mean? And then what would that mean? And what would that mean? Until you get to this sort of like deeper place. But it can be done much more empathically, but I think it's a hard thing to demonstrate in role play. Could ask the client to complete these statements. I am, others are, the world is, as a way of accessing. Again, it may be harder to do if the person's not actually triggered or activated in session. We can ask, what rules did you learn as a child? Or what rules were important to you in your family? And this can be an interesting one that can unearth kind of things that maybe weren't necessarily standout traumatic, but just things that were valued, that if you're then acting in a way that are not, or for whatever reason that you're experiencing the world in a way that is not consistent with that rule, can then sort of trigger this. So a rule back to the idea about being a failure, the rule might be like second place is the first loser. I think that comes from like Talladega Nights or something. But if that was a rule in your family, you could see how I'm a failure, if you're not always getting first, could very quickly be developed and reinforced. If you're going into competitions where it's hard to get first place, for example. Or you might be reflecting on a specific experience and asking, well, what did that teach you about the world? So, when your mom left the family at the age of 3 and didn't return for several years, what did that teach you about the world or about yourself or about other people, for example? What did you learn from that experience? So different ways for us to get to that information. So we can use that then to develop this longitudinal model, or Morrison's model of psychosis. This is from Toni Morrison's paper back in 2001 about the interpretation of intrusions into awareness. And he really conceptualizes positive symptoms as being these intrusions into our awareness. And it's the interpretation rather than the intrusion itself. So it's the interpretation of the hallucination rather than the hallucination itself that causes distress and disability. I think that's a fairly established understanding of psychosis now. And then symptoms are maintained by mood, arousal, and maladaptive cognitive behavioral responses such as avoidance. And it's that we then really need to understand and look at. This is the model that he puts forward in the paper, which I think is very, very clever, but also quite inaccessible for a client, and oftentimes inaccessible for me if I haven't got my thinking hat on. So happily, they created a more client and Kate-friendly version of this. So what does that look like? Essentially, the idea of the event or what happened, how I made sense of it or the interpretation, the beliefs about yourself and others, what do you do when this happens, or the action or the behavior, how does it make you feel, and then the life experiences. This is the point where we can really incorporate those life experiences to have an understanding about the role that they might have in the formation of these experiences. So going back to our example from earlier, so this is Sam, kind of based on a client but also slightly made up guy. So in later sessions, Sam described some of his early experiences. He discloses he was regularly bullied at school, including an incident where a boy whom he thought was a friend turned on him and joined his bullies. He was also berated and criticized by his father for low grades. So if we plug that information in, so we've got the same event, here's voices knocking and taunting, or here's a threatening voice. He makes sense of it by thinking that the neighbors are talking about me. He talks to the voices, stays in his room, isolates as he did before. He feels scared, he feels hopeless, he feels anxious. But we're adding this information about poor grades in school, bullied at school, and having this critical father in his life. And then what he learned through this and through these experiences was, I'm a failure, I'm different, and others can't be trusted. And what I should also be pointing out is as we're developing this, and again, developing this collaboratively with the client, is taking a moment to step back and ask the client, does this, well, actually, first of all, stepping back for a moment in yourself and asking, does this fit? If I'd had those experiences, does it make sense that I would have had those beliefs? Does it make sense that I would feel in that way? So is this kind of just past the fit test? Does this make sense? And then our second check is to ask for feedback from the client and say, well, does this make sense? Does this fit? Are we missing anything? Is there anything that we haven't captured here? Does this go together appropriately? How do we make sense of this? So we want to elicit feedback in that sense to make sure that we're all on the same page. And we might want to even ask the client to summarize this and to kind of narrate this and to put it together once we've drawn this out as a diagram. And that's not very clear either, and I thought we'd been able to do that. So this is an example of one that I did on paper next to a client drawing it out sort of together, where we pulled in these early experiences. And again, this was the first time that he'd really reflected on his early experiences and thought about how this influenced his beliefs. So the event here was that he'd been at Black Panther, the film that's currently out in the world, and rather marvelous. I went to see it because I like to say for work, but it was wonderful because all my clients were seeing it and told me I should see it. So he, as at Black Panther, the event was that he remembered a feeling that he'd had in childhood, and that he'd had, and he remembered through that process that he'd had this sad childhood, and his thoughts that I had a childhood that I need to recover from now. He found that his mood dropped to a 1 out of 10. It became low, and he felt really empty. And I'm sorry, I'm struggling to read my own writing here. That people, so then some of the early experiences he then reflected on was a sad childhood. I'm cheating by pulling up the original one. That he reflected that his parents weren't as good as he might have liked, and that he was essentially parented through the television. He described it, that he was sort of left to kind of hang out in front of the TV rather than sort of being engaged with in the way that he wanted. No, I'm trying to get you the... Okay. That his dad would often put him down, telling him to stop talking and that you're being annoying, and would be yelled at for stupid things. That his brother was born and was 6 years younger than him, and at that point that he felt like the attention really turned to his brother and there was less time for him, leading him to be parented more by the television. That his mom was really busy with work, but although mom was primary caregiver, and the dad would really zone out, was struggling with his own addiction problems to opioids, and that his parents then separated at the age, divorced at the age of 12 and separated at the age of 10. And that this led to the development of these beliefs that people don't appreciate me, my family is dysfunctional, it's normal to be put down, and that I'm alone. And all of this was really then incorporated into his understanding that he then, the behaviors are that then he made friends with people who would typically put him down because that was kind of his expectation. So sort of pulling together this information from these past experiences helped him to have this different appreciation of how he then seeks out friends who are maybe not the best fit for him and will repeat this pattern. And it's not on here because, again, we were sort of thinking about how would this information be received and how would it impact. He's somebody who has a very positive delusional belief about ultimately he will go through this feminine transformation, and at that point he'll become a famous rapper, and that he has friends on the internet who will send him messages, tons of ideas of reference. It's very, very protective. But it helped me understand that experience from the context of from the context of people don't appreciate me to the need within the psychosis to be really, really appreciated by people on Twitter and on Instagram and by famous rappers. And again, to be very careful about, as we're sort of beginning to chip away at that and to think about that in the context, because it really interrupts his functioning, what are we trying to replace that with? Oh, and then, sorry, I missed that coming in. There's a question, or a statement rather, so it looks like this is an idea from the audience or the participants, that you could ask, what kind of life experiences do you have that relates to your beliefs of yourself? Yeah, absolutely. It's a good way of then trying to make this link and trying to put this together. So that's an example that didn't show up quite as well as I would have hoped, but showing how we can use those experiences to then understand better these beliefs and how these beliefs inform other things and what might need to change because of that. And from this, he determined that he wanted to learn how to redirect his attention when this comes up and how to use music and meditation and exercise as a way of improving his mood. So he was actually really getting behind more behavioral interventions, and he predicted that he was able to do, I think it was the exercise he went with, to do exercise for 10 minutes over the next week each day, that his mood would increase to a 4 or a 7 out of 10. And that was the homework, essentially, was to test that as the first step in sort of working through this formulation. All right, so we are going to pause and go over to a participant on the call, which I think is Lauren is going to do this one. So Lauren, if you're available and around, I see the telephone next to you, and you're going to help us think through one of these. So Tiara, can you unmute Lauren? She should be unmuted. Lauren, are you there? Are you talking? You might need to unmute yourself. Let's see. Tiara's typing to me to see if Mission Control's got any good ideas over there. Lauren, you may or may not be unmuted. If you're there, maybe you can just do a quick public chat, or Tiara's going to unmute everyone to get to her and monitor the chatter. Hi, is that Lauren?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, then we may not need to unmute everybody. All right, we've got Lauren, that's good. And then I think what Tiara's going to do is just kind of control the sound for everybody else so we don't have tons of background noise. Awesome. So Lauren, do you want to just talk us through this client, give us a quick summary of them, and then we'll see if we can plug that information into this formulation?
Okay. Her name is Lisa. She's 29 years old. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And her first psychosis was 2007. Yeah. And I don't know what information I should give you. I don't know.
All right. So then tell us a little bit about, is there a specific event or problem that we would want to be focusing on here with her?
Well, she has a hard time looking for work or finding a job. And part of it is that she keeps herself, she feels like she's a failure because she has schizophrenia.
Okay.
She gets stuck in this loop of, I can't find a job, I'm a failure, I'm a fraud, and it's because I have schizophrenia.
All right, so I'm typing in there, so already we kind of got to the belief pretty quickly if I'm a failure, and we've got these thoughts. So I'm guessing maybe an event might be that she tries to find a job, or she reaches out, or she submits an application. It might be what would trigger this, yeah?
And often, I mean, she has looked for work, and the part of the thing, well, maybe the event is, I don't know, she wants to get Social Security disability, so this is kind of backtrack a little bit. She wants to get disability, but she has to have so many credits of work every year.
Gotcha.
able to find a job in order to do that.
Gotcha. Okay, so she looks for work. As she's not able to do so, she makes sense of that, of like, I can't find a job, I have schizophrenia, and underlying that what makes that distressing is this I'm a failure belief. And then how does she feel?
She feels very depressed.
Okay. And what does she do?
She will then do more things that cause her to be more depressed. She spends more time sleeping. She spends more time binge watching Netflix. And she's very isolated socially anyway. She lives with her parents. Kind of.
Oh, just pause for a second. It looks like everybody's lost audio, so I think just pause while Tiara brings everybody back in. Some people have, some people haven't. I think Tiara's mission command is figuring it out. Awesome. I'm so glad I don't have to. I'm glad all I have to do is talk about formulation and not have to figure out the technology. It's far more complicated a job than what I'm doing. So as we're doing that, so, and I'm going to keep typing, so I guess people are going to see that. So behaviorally, she sleeps, she watches Netflix, she isolates. Does she engage in any sort of self-criticism?
I'm sorry, she engaged in any what?
In any self-criticism?
Oh yes, yes. I'm incapable of. I don't have any friends because people don't like me. I'm unemployable. I'm not smart enough to go back to grad school. She's brilliant. She's very.
Gotcha. So tons of thoughts that she would engage in and really sort of criticize and beat herself up over. Tell me about the life experiences that you know of that, I lost depressed, but depressed should be over here somewhere.
Yeah, her life experience.
What she experienced that has led her to have this belief of I'm a failure before schizophrenia, if there's anything?
Yes, it definitely informs her belief system. Her father was extremely critical of her and her sister, Kristen, and who is actually older than she is. And he was worse with Kristen, but he was bad with Lisa as well. I mean, her sister Kristen got a perfect score on the SAT, and he still found a reason to criticize it.
The critical father of both sisters.
Yeah.
And any other things? How was her performance when she was growing up? Would she get good grades and still be criticized, or were there high expectations of her?
There were high expectations, and even though she did very well, he still would find a way to criticize her. Like she could have gotten a better grade, even though she had, I think she graduated with higher than a 4.0 from high school.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you. I'm going to pause because it seems like some people can hear and some people can't. So I'm going to let Tiara do her magic and let everyone talk again and stop you from talking, Lauren.
Okay.
And then thank you for sharing that, and I'll talk through this. Thank you so much.
Okay. You're welcome.
Oh, no.
So Tiara, you can go back to whatever it was before, and we can see if everyone can listen again. All right. Can everyone hear us again now? Shanna, can you hear us? Sorry about that. I'm guessing if Shanna's saying she can't, I'm guessing if Shanna's not responding, that means she can't hear us. Huh. Okay, well, I'm going to forge ahead regardless. So I'm thinking many people heard, some people might not have. Those people may still not be able to hear. Who knows? Let me just summarize this real quick. So what we've got here is a client who is looking for work, trying to find jobs so she can get more credits so she can go into disability, getting rejected, can't find a job, and so how she makes sense of being rejected from the work is, I can't find a job, I have schizophrenia. There were lots of other thoughts that came out as Lauren was talking about this, but this underlying belief that she uses to make sense of herself and to make sense of the situation is, I'm a failure. She feels very depressed, and then she engages in these behaviors of sleeping a lot, watching Netflix, isolating, and self-criticizing. And we can certainly see that again in this context of maintaining a problem, because that's going to make it really hard for her to go after this goal of getting a job if she's isolating, if she's sleeping, if she's watching Netflix, and if she's beating herself up. You know, certainly some self-talk can be motivating, but self-criticism is going to be very demotivating, particularly knowing that she has these life experiences of a critical father with very high expectations that even when she achieved, she was still criticized for. So really sort of internalizing that sort of critical self and critical father. So just pausing for a drink. I guess, again, what we can do with this intervention, or this formulation rather, is use it to inform our interventions. And first of all, I think having a formulation like this that allows the client to reflect on the life experiences can help them to start to see how we can really be the product of what we've been exposed to. This isn't about blaming. It isn't about blaming families, but just recognizing the roles that our environment and what we've been exposed to and what we've lived through can have on how we make sense of the world now. Because similarly, just moving from self-criticism to other criticism, so if we, if she was suddenly to go to, gosh, this isn't my fault, this is my dad, and then to sit in a place of just criticizing him, that's still not going to help her look for work. So we don't want to kind of move to this place of blame, but rather just recognition and understanding. I often will say that formulation is about explaining a behavior. It's not about excusing it. And I think that's another thing that formulation can really do. So in terms of interventions, just as we did before, we can look at the behavioral level. We can look at how internalizing this self-criticism is actually really demotivating, and maybe we would be coaching and supporting her to respond to herself from a more compassionate place, something that maybe she wasn't able to learn or internalize as a child because it wasn't something that was taught to her or something that was present in her family. We can explore the thoughts about, I can't find a job, this is hopeless, I'm never going to get a job, I have schizophrenia, schizophrenia means I won't get a job, or whatever those are. We can explore those interpretations. Or we can look at these beliefs about I'm a failure and work at that core belief level and all of the different things that we can do with beliefs. So for example, we might want to help educate her first of all about how beliefs operate and how they're almost Teflon coated in some way, so that they magnetize, they attract information in the world and evidence in the world that is consistent. So she is going to be very aware of and attracted to and will internalize things that fits with the belief I'm a failure. But anything that contradicts that is just going to bounce right off this Teflon coated belief system. And so we could provide some education around that, around how it acts as a filter or a lens on the world, and encourage her to start to either, we might want to go retrospectively, what were examples of success that maybe she overlooked or weren't recognized in the past? What have been examples of more recent successes that perhaps she hasn't seen because of this lens? We might want to define failure and success and put this on a continuum and an understanding, instead of it being a black and white thing, either you have failed or you've succeeded, having more of a continuum that allows for a more kind of moderate view of these two extremes, and putting different pieces of information on there as well. So again, lots of different places where we can intervene using a formulation like this. All right, so I'm pausing for a second because Tiara's saying, apologies for the technical issues. but she's also recording. You'll be able to view any of the sections that you've missed if you desperately want to go back and review, or just want to use this as a sleep aid at any point. That's also an option. Lauren was typing, and I'm just wanting to pause just to see if there's anything that she had a recent big success too. That's awesome, and I'd be curious if she was able to internalize that and recognize that, or if that was something that she just bounced off this belief system. So I'm not going to go too much into core beliefs in general, but there's this idea of a prejudice model that when we hold core beliefs, any information that contradicts the core belief gets processed in one of three ways. We might just ignore it, just like, la, 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 I don't see that, it's not there. We might take it as the exception to the rule. So like, yeah, sure, that was a success, but that's the only time I've been a success. Or hang on, ignore it, exception to the rule, or just discount it. Like, well, that doesn't count. That doesn't matter. Anyone could get that Nobel Prize. That's no big, right? So we again, as a part of this process, might want to educate a person about that. And as Lauren's saying, she started to internalize it, which is really huge and really great. And I think it really speaks to how when we work with beliefs, it's a process. This isn't a quick overnight thing. These are beliefs that have formed over years. And so starting to internalize is part of that process. It's not just a sudden roundabout, oh, I'm not a failure, you're right, thank you so much, everything's better in my life now. Something that's going to change over time. All right, so we're going to move on from this one and on to our final formulation for the day, unless people have any questions at this point about the longitudinal one. Other than what did you just say because it was muted for me? No, looks like everyone's good. That's good. Okay, so the final one we're going to look at in the last half hour is this kind of idea of this making sense formulation. I also think about it as being a systems-based formulation because it's something that we can do as a system or as a team. And so it's from the Cognitive Therapy for Schizophrenia book written by David Kingdon and Doug Turkington, and they refer to it as the making sense formulation, so that's why I refer to it as such, because that's what they called it. And it pulls in all the information that we've already seen from the previous formulations, but allows for the consideration of additional information, including, really importantly, strengths or protective factors, which is not something that's a feature of the other two formulations. So this is a really nice one for identifying with the client or with a team or with a family what are some of the strengths that the individual has, what are some of their protective factors, because that can be equally important when we're thinking about interventions. We can also incorporate here physical issues, social issues, and systemic factors. So what it really gives us is a sort of big picture view. So it can be helpful for the incorporation of information from multiple sources. It can help us identify levels of intervention from a team perspective. We can do it to support intervention when a client is not engaging. So if we're not even able to work with a client in the room for some reason, I like to think about this as something that we can do if we want to step back, look at all the information that we've got, and then think as a team, why isn't this client engaging? What's going on and what can we do to help? Instead of, and it's a way of then countering what can often happen in teams when a client isn't engaging, which we can sometimes inadvertently move to blaming or dismissing, or they don't want treatment, or well, we're doing the best, but they're not getting involved here. Using something like this can help us perhaps understand why that is and if there's anything we can do about that. Can enhance clinician understanding and potentially empathy of a client. Again, if we're working with a client with complex needs who is maybe getting into the dynamic of sort of help seeking but help dismissing. Again, I think as a team or as clinicians, we can struggle with that, and it's understandable, it's hard. But using a formulation like this can help to understand maybe why that dynamic and that process has evolved and what we can do about that. And just like some of the other formulations, we can identify what we can change and what is stable and what we just have to accept is there as something that's not going to be changeable immediately or at all possibly. Can complete this based on assessment information in a team consultation and add to over time or directly with the client. As you will see, it may be overwhelming to do with a client. So again, it's something that we want to make sure we have a good relationship with the client first. And this is essentially what it looks like. Again, I should say, I think I've spoken to this, but none of these formulations are, except for the general premise of making sure that you link thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, none of these formulations are done in the sense that there's an evidence base to suggest it has to be exactly as I've drawn it or as the people have drawn it. There's no literature that says if you put a line here, an arrow there, it's going to make it more effective than if you put a box over here. If you make the maintenance formulation more like a circle than a diamond, that's cool. Be creative, do what fits, while still adhering to the ethos and the principles of it. Also, a point I should have made earlier is don't use the word formulation if formulation as a word or as a language is meaningless to the client. I was on consultation with Michigan yesterday, I think, and somebody shared that their client refers to the formulation as a thought map, which I think is fabulous. So formulation is just a meaningless term, which it is unless you've had the training as to what that means. Find a word that's going to fit, the diagram, the way of putting the information together, a thought map, a roadmap for therapy, a treatment plan, whatever is going to be meaningful, use that. So here we have these kind of boxes to complete as part of the process of developing the making sense formulation. And so in line with what we've had before, we've got thoughts, feelings, and behaviors or actions. Current concerns is a way of sort of capturing what is on the problem list, what are the symptoms, what are the things that the client wants to work on. It allows us to also incorporate social and physical factors. So, you know, if somebody's experiencing a lot of anxiety, this is a good place to then capture that person's heart rate really starts to race when they get anxious, or they start to shake or feel nauseous. We might want to put that in there. We might also want to capture other physical experiences or side effects maybe. A whole host of things can go in there. Social might be any social needs or social elements of what the person's experiencing. That might be why we would want to refer to how isolated a client is or how connected their support network is, whether they've just had a relationship breakdown or they recently got divorced or recently went into a relationship. Underlying concerns is a place where you could put core beliefs. It's also a place where you might want to put sort of aspirations, like, well, I really want a job, but I don't think I can get one because I have schizophrenia, to go back to that client earlier. And then maybe just putting that into that core belief of I'm a failure in there. And then along the top, I guess, is where it really looks a little bit different. So here we have this predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, and protective. And you can have a situational experience or an event or a descriptor in more than one of those boxes. So predisposing are things that have predisposed an individual to develop certain mental health problems. For example, we might put in there a family history of a certain mental health problem. We might put prenatal, perinatal challenges or difficulties in there. We might put attachment style or childhood trauma in there, sort of neglect or sexual abuse or physical abuse. Bullying, experiences of sort of maybe moving around, emigration, all kinds of different experiences that predispose the person to mental health problems would go in there. Precipitating would be more like factors that are quite close to the onset of the mental health problem or the most recent sort of mental health crisis, if you like. There aren't necessarily time limits around this, so it's not like predisposing goes up to the age of 18 and precipitating's after that. It's more just about what is considered to be a distal factor compared with a more proximal factor, so something further in the past versus something closer to the event. So precipitating could be, if we think about an early psychosis population, could be starting to use cannabis, going off to college, break up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, family stresses, who knows, whatever might be a kind of a stressful event for the person around that time, losing a job, moving house, moving away to college, an assault, could have childhood sexual abuse in predisposing, and then a sexual assault in precipitating. Perpetuating are factors that maybe are maintaining the challenges. So just like we said, precipitating could be the starting to use cannabis. Perpetuating might be the ongoing use of cannabis. Precipitating might be family stress in the family, let's say familial breakdown for some reason. Perpetuating might be continued family conflict. And then protective, and this is a reason why I really like this one, it allows us as clinicians, if we're doing it as a team and with the client individually, to really think about the strengths and the things that are supporting the person that keeps them going. What are the protective factors, their resiliencies, their strengths? And again, we could have things in multiple places. So precipitating could be familial breakdown or family breakdown of the I don't know, core family system for some reason, say divorce. Perpetuating ongoing familial conflict. But protective is, even despite that, the family is still really supportive. So, like I say, it can be in multiple places, but we want to look for any of the protective factors that the person has or their strengths that often get overlooked in formulation. So, kind of a big picture approach. And like I mentioned, this is something, again, you can do individually with the client, but what we often do here in our clinic is if we're having a challenge when we're thinking about a client, we're not really sure how to think about them, how best to help them, feeling a bit lost, a bit stuck, struggling to think about the treatment plan, we might sit down in a kind of a complex case formulation team meeting, which we have periodically, and get input from all members of the team. And so, you know, often this is sort of kind of therapist-driven formulation. That's kind of the purview of what we do. But this is an opportunity for the social worker to put information in that they understand and from their perspective. And so they're going to have a lot of information from that social box, for example. And also for the psychiatrist in our team. And our team consists purely of psychology, psychiatry, and social work. But certainly in a team that was larger, you would be incorporating maybe the occupational therapist, supported education and employment worker, peer worker, family worker, to get all of these different narratives, and as a way of capturing all of that to then identify what can we do, and what can we do from each of the different roles as well. So what does this look like as an example? Well, let me just take a drink, sorry. This was a clinical high-risk young female that I assessed a little while ago, and sort of pulling together because there was so much going on with her and because there'd been so many providers involved. She was really just coming to us for assessment and then treatment recommendations. This is a way of sort of pulling together all of that information. So she was somebody who had grown up in a family that had a gang affiliation, and when she was, I think, around the age of 7, both her parents used substances, and her father was in jail. Her mother decided she really needed to go to rehab and get straightened out. And so she took her daughter to her grandmother's house for a party and essentially never came back to collect her, or rather did come back, but not for like another 5 years. So she called that sort of being abandoned at her grandmother's. And she experienced homelessness as a child while her father was in prison. She and her mom and her younger brother would live out of the car and sort of move around a lot. So, you know, a lot of early stresses that were really quite influential. Prior to the onset of sort of her attenuated psychotic symptoms, she had experienced the murder of her best friend, who actually she was waiting for on a street corner. She heard the gunshots and kind of, you know, wondered what on earth was going on, and then later learned that it was her best friend who'd been shot on the way to come and meet her. There'd been an increased number of violent deaths in the area, so sort of really aware of the kind of the unsafety of the neighborhood. Perpetuating, like I say, was the neighborhood that she was in, where there was a lot of gang violence, and that she was experiencing a lot of interpersonal conflict at school. But in terms of protective features, she had a very, very supportive family. Dad was out of prison, Mom, and both were no longer using substances, and neither of them were engaged in the gang affiliation anymore, although still lived in the neighborhood. She herself was very resilient, as were the family. And she had a lot of very strong future-oriented goals. In fact, she wanted to become a social worker, which was pretty awesome. She presented with these kind of two problems of like, I can't trust anyone, and that she would have visions of her best friend that were very distressing to her. So kind of not necessarily culturally congruent visions, but ones that were really, really upsetting to see this. Her thoughts were, if I let my guard down, I'll get hurt. I don't want to remember the past. So she would engage in a lot of behaviors to push that away, a lot of cognitive avoidance as an action. She was very hypervigilant in her neighborhood, which made sense given her experiences. She would push people away because she didn't feel like she could trust them, and would walk around carrying a knife at all times. She would ruminate, but then she would also engage in this cognitive avoidance of pushing away her past, and would use a lot of cannabis for relaxation and try to address her incredibly poor sleep pattern. It was totally shot out of whack. She felt numb and very, very afraid when she was out. No close friends socially, and engaged in a lot of frequent fights with her peers. And these underlying concerns of, I'm not safe, others can't be trusted, and I'm really on my own in this. I've got to figure this out on my own. So when we think about kind of what could we address, well, her current concerns are, I can't trust anyone, these visions of a best friend. So how can we start to address that? Well, we can look at some of the behaviors and work at that level, work with this cognitive avoidance, work with the hypervigilance, try to find ways to help her feel safe and to reach out to people, certainly trying to address the cannabis use. Addressing the sleep was a really important treatment recommendation that we made, that you can imagine different people on the team would have different levels of input on. Addressing her underlying concerns, because without those changing, it might be really hard for her to reach out and trust people. Address them with thoughts that she was experiencing. Hello, that's not very helpful. Let's go back. We could think about sort of socially, helping her to sort of learn new strategies to not engage in these fights, and they're often physical fights, and there should be also another circle on there, I don't know where it's disappeared to, which is about leveraging those protective factors, so engaging her family in supporting her, drawing upon this resilience and drawing upon these strong future goals as well. So what this making sense formulation allows is the identification of these different levels of intervention and identification of who on the team is best to lead each of those. So we get this sort of multi-pronged approach. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Oh no, it's all gone wrong. Hang on a second. There we go. There we go. And then just another example, back to my guide from earlier. So this looks a little bit less full because I'm still pulling this together. I've forgotten to include in this one. This is kind of fun. So predisposing, this is somebody who's very introverted, very shy, very gentle, his mom would call him. He was a substitute teacher, feels lots of stress around that, romantically attracted to a student, ? Actually, I can remove that question mark now because that's something we've talked about a lot more recently. And he was rejected by that student, and also was aware that it was not a relationship he should engage in, even though actually age-wise, legally, it would have been okay. He had this duty of care to this individual, and he should, per his perception of it, he should not pursue that, and I guess ethically probably shouldn't either. And so kind of really a catastrophic experience for him as a precipitating event, perpetuating his very shy, very introverted individual, protective, highly articulate, rather engaged in family, in treatment, supportive family. He was an opera singer by background, very likable. Despite some of the things he talks about, he's actually a really likable person, and very caring. Current concerns, his Aryan Brotherhood line can be boring. He's socially isolated, is unemployed. And then we've got, again, sort of thoughts, feelings, and actions that we've talked about earlier. Socially very isolated, physically overweight and inactive. And that's important to put into this formulation and to consider, because as we talk to him about becoming more engaged in the world, one of his concerns about that is, I'm overweight and I'll do that when I've lost weight, or I'll put a picture up on Facebook when I look thin again, or I'll go to the gym when I'm thinner. And then he'll also engage in behaviors to try and lose weight and take on quite extreme diets that we've had to be quite careful about. So important to include that physical aspect. and then his underlying concerns that he'll use these languages, this language which is why it's in quotation marks, is the situation, which is the one about, am I really in this organization or not? Am I schizophrenic? Is an underlying concern for him. And then this belief about being, I'm a dirt nothing, using his language. So again, all very useful for us to know, but highlights actually we still need to know a lot more about him, and we're still missing a lot of information there. And again, developed as a team to try and understand how we can support him. All right, so we've got sort of 14 minutes left. Excuse me. I think, Nishan, you're going to come on next, and we're going to see if this is going to be successful without interrupting the mute. And I think, Tiara, for your reference, I think Nishan is masquerading under the guise of Scott 2. So I don't know if that helps you find her, just to make life harder for you, Tiara. Yeah, well, no, it's going to be hard. Okay. And if for some reason we can't unmute and it's going to all go to pot, then that's fine, because I just realized that given how we type into this, it might be a little bit harder given I haven't got a blank one here. Try pressing 1 to unmute. Me or Nishan? Nishan, can you try pressing 1 to unmute, Nishan? And if not, and we need to abandon this, that's okay. We will just open up the floor for questions in the last 10 minutes. And listen to crickets. Star 1. Yeah, technology might be defeating us. So as we're figuring this out, those of you that are sat there scratching your heads and wondering why in the 21st century somebody sat at Stanford can't figure stuff like this out, and it's true, it's basically because I'm incompetent. Oh, Nishan's typing. She's trying. Yeah, no. I think on your computer, Nishan, not on your computer, on your phone, try pressing star 1. For those of you not engaged in this fun and frolics, start thinking about some questions that you might have for me while you've got me for the next 10 minutes. And start typing them in, because we know that the typing often takes a little bit of time. So any burning questions, anything you want to know from today, anything that came out, any feedback, any comments, anything that I got totally wrong, anything you're just curious about, how long have I had this cough, when's it going to go away? Those are great questions. I wish I had the answer to that. Actually, I didn't cough that much. Why do I waffle? Yeah, because I'm British. I don't know. I tried it, but it said I'm not authorized. Oh, Nishan, that's no good. Sorry about that. I'd authorize you if I knew how to. I reckon I could be a news presenter. I can just waffle on and fill the gaps while the technology falls to pieces around us. Do you sometimes find, oh, Ron, you've got a question. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Ron. So do you sometimes then share the formulation the team has developed with the client? Yes. That's a great question. So have I ever done that? I don't think I've ever directly just presented it to the client. I think what I've done is taken what the team has put together and used it to then do it collaboratively with the client. I've not since that failed attempt back when I was like in training at the age of like 22, ever just gone like, hey, look, wow, doesn't this figure everything out? What I would love, and I'd love to test and trial, would be having a team formulation process that engages the family and client in it. Because I actually think formulation in and of itself is an intervention. I think just the process of sitting down and figuring it out, when I ask clients for feedback at the end and like, what was it like throwing this out on the board, I have honestly, maybe people are scared of me, I don't know, or too polite, but I've never had anyone say that they didn't like it. People often will be saying, like, wow, I can't believe it makes sense. I can't believe how this fits together. That's really helped me see this from a different perspective. Like, people generally find the process of formulation very helpful, and I see that as an intervention, even if we don't say what we're going to do next. I mean, it should lead to intervention, but it's like the first step of that intervention. So no, I've never taken this making sense formulation and just given it to a client. But I'd be curious if other people have and how that went. Other questions or curiosities or feedback or things that folk want to throw out there in the last 10 minutes while Nishan and Tiara continue to figure out the technology. What else can I say about formulation that I haven't already said while people are typing in and Nishan's and Tiara trying to problem solve? Yeah, I think just to, I've already said it, but just to re-emphasize, I'm a real stickler for it. I think what I find when I'm training clinicians, and I get this, and because I get the poll myself, is that we want to dive into interventions. We want to do things instantly with folk. And that's great, and I think that comes from a place of wanting to help and wanting to be effective. But like I said earlier, if we don't know what to do, if we don't know what intervention is going to stick, if we don't know what's going to be helpful, then we run the risk of just throwing tools and skills at the person. And yay, if it works the first time, but if it doesn't and we keep trying and doing stuff, which we should, if the client's kind of getting despondent, dispirited, by that process and further kind of reinforcing nothing's helping, nothing's working, if we slow down and take time to have the formulation to then tell us, well, we based on the formulation, this is the thing that should be the most helpful. It's almost algorithmic in that way. Then we're going to it's going to be much more high yield in that sense. And then another question about, have you used the initial formulation maintenance with individuals directly? Absolutely. So I formulate the heck out of my day. So I'm doing those pretty much every session that I'm in. And sometimes not in sessions, sometimes in other places, and with myself too. A great way to practice this is to do these for yourself. Take that maintenance formulation the next time you're frustrated or upset or anxious, and just slow it down and think, what am I thinking right now? How am I feeling and how am I acting? And make that link. And because if we can't do it for ourselves, how can we expect our clients to ever do it? So, I'm definitely using that with the client. So all of these three you can do with a client. The first one, quick and dirty, nice and easy. Break it down to be as simple as you want. Break it down to just being a link between thought and emotion, or thought and behavior and emotion. It doesn't have to be all four pieces. Just go with where it's going to work with the client, depending on their presentation and where they're at in therapy and how cognitively oriented they are. So all three can be done with the client. The maintenance one is the easiest because it's the simplest and it's the shortest and it's one people get behind. Longitudinal, adding that early experience piece, is going to take a little bit more time. Going to make sure that the client's in the right place to be able to get behind that. And then this making sense can be a little bit more overwhelming, but can be very high yield if you're going to work with a client to do that. And another question, a really nice question, how do we know when we're done exploring and it's time for the intervention? I think, again, this is just really iterative, and I think that's the problem with trainings like this and any of the books that you read is it's always linear, right? We set an agenda, no, we do a problem list, we identify goals, we get into therapy, we set an agenda, we identify the problem, we do the formulation, we do an intervention, we set homework, and off the client goes. And yes, it can work like that, but oftentimes we're doing a formulation, we find the intervention, we go and do the intervention, and then we go, oh, actually, we don't have enough information about that. Let's go back to the formulation. So it's often a kind of a back and forth, and the two are really informing each other. But I would say, when you're done exploring, when you've sort of exhausted that topic, so you've, particularly with the maintenance formulation, you've identified the intervention, you've caught all the thoughts, you've got the thought that's the most distressing, you've identified the most distressing emotion, you've identified the behaviors, and you can step back and go, yeah, that's a pretty good summary of what happened. Now what are we going to do about it? What's our intervention? With the longitudinal, it might be a little bit more, and it's something that you're really developing over time as you get to know the client, as they get to know you, as more information comes to light, as things that maybe felt irrelevant become relevant to the client. You know, if you were somebody who grew up in a critical household and that was just what you knew, then that might not be something that the person shares with you, just because why would you? It's just, that's just life. Isn't everyone critical? It's only through the process of asking and doing this that the client might be like, I wonder if the fact that my dad was kind of pretty critical of me might have something to do with me always kind of criticizing myself. And you're like, oh, maybe, let's explore that now. So it really is kind of a process in that respect. It's looking like Nishan and Tiara are still struggling. So Nishan, thank you so much for being open to doing this. I'm sorry the technology didn't support us. I see one more question coming in, which I'll take as we sort of finish up. I'm just pausing for that question to come up. And while it is doing, I will remember, amazingly, to remind you all to complete the, I'm trying to find it, the TAN survey that's going to be coming, that's going to be coming at the end of this session. And it wasn't a question, it was somebody had lost audio. So yes, the recording's available, like I say, for viewing later, and I don't know, a sleep aid or any parties that people want to show it at, you know, to have a really good time. I know that formulation is that exciting. Actually, no, genuinely, I get really geeky about this, and I often have to apologize to my clients, because when we're doing a formulation and it's going well and it's making sense, I can get really excited about that, and you know, I think that's sometimes infectious, or sometimes I have to apologize and just explain that I'm a real geek about formulation stuff, because I really think it's very valuable. All right, we've got the survey on your public chat, so click on that and go ahead and complete that, and Tiara will be able to let you know how to access the slides and recordings. I'm sure there'll be an email going out about that. And otherwise, unless there are any other questions, I see people beginning to hang up, which makes sense. So otherwise, we'll call an end to the call. So thank you for spending your time with us today, and I hope that you have enjoyed formulation and are inspired to go away and formulate the heck out of stuff, including yourselves. All right, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.